Megan Boardman ahead of us. She's taught thousands of therapists across the globe about EMDR, and she's one of Patsy's most in-demand trainers. So we're going to learn a lot. If you're new to EMDR, this is your chance to take a look under the hood and see what you can do. And if you've trained on EMDR before, this should be a fantastic refresher for you. There's a lot of great information in store for us. I don't want to hold this up for too long. So that's probably enough for me. Let's kick the whole thing off with a quick introduction to Megan. Megan is one of my absolute favorite trainers. We get so many comments from students who just love the way she makes concepts easy to understand, apply. She is a licensed clinical social worker who, again, has trained thousands of clinicians on how they can get the most out of EMDR, trauma, and addiction-based skills and practices. She's regularly invited to speak at years of trauma, addictions, and abuse at conferences, both here in the U.S. and abroad. And she's the author of the EMDR Workbook for Trauma and PTSD, set to be released by New Harbinger in 2023. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring Megan on the screen, and Megan, they are all yours.
Thank you, Ryan. I just want to welcome everyone and just take a moment and just say I'm really grateful that you all are here with us and that you get this opportunity, especially from PESI that's offering this live 2-day event. I know a lot of you have had questions about what EMDR looks like, if it's something that you're interested in, or trying to decipher if it's something that your clients would use. And so I just want to thank you for taking this opportunity to be here so that you can better serve your clients, or maybe even find a modality that fits your practice better. You might love it and you might hate it, and that's okay. Just keep in mind that EMDR is a client-centered approach, and sometimes I think it's a clinician-centered approach as well. So everyone has kind of their preference. We're going to be learning a lot about the basics of what EMDR is. And so we're going to go through kind of just some of the other things that are going to be important for us to cover before we jump into EMDR. And I feel strongly about kind of helping you understand why EMDR works the way that it does by leading with a little bit of psychoeducation on trauma. So that's kind of where we'll start today. And I just want to share a little bit about me and how I came to just love EMDR and start utilizing EMDR. I was a skeptic, maybe like a lot of you that are joining today, about EMDR. And I remember thinking, none of my clients are going to want to do this, right? The eye movement thing is weird. How am I going to get people to sign up for wanting to do this in therapy? And one of my closest friends, who's also a clinician, she went to a training in Phoenix, and she ended up falling in love with this trainer, and she's like, you have to do this. And so I ended up kind of connecting with this trainer. He had trained under Francine Shapiro and had been on the head of the International Association of Embrya for many years. And I was grateful enough that he took a liking in me and my practice and the way that I used EMDR. And not only I ended up getting trained with him, and the very first day on the training, I remember still being a skeptic until we went into our practice sessions and our breakouts together. And it was from that time that I saw just how impactful EMDR is. And I'm going to give you little snippets of that. We're going to still do some hands-on skills today that I'll teach you, and tomorrow that we'll get to use as a group. And you'll get to see just how effective and wonderful EMDR can be. And it's ultimately life-changing. I've seen it change hundreds, if not thousands of lives, not just from my own practice, but with other clinicians that I consult that see clients that have just had major complex trauma where they finally made progress. So after I got trained, I was lucky enough to get to start working with the trainer that trained me, and he taught me a lot about EMDR. And so I have a lot of respect for the work around EMDR and for Francine Shapiro. And I really try to teach true to the fidelity of the model, because I believe that we should honor that. So without more information, I want to get headed over to our slides, and we're going to jump in and just kind of start going from the beginning of a few things I want you guys to know. We'll get into trauma. I have some interactive activities that we're going to be doing this morning that will hopefully be helpful for you. I feel like as clinicians we don't get enough tools or skills as it is, so I always try to give you things that you guys can utilize and take away, because I know how valuable that can be. And then from there, we'll get going into some EMDR. I love questions and interactions. Anyone that's taken a training from me before knows that I normally teach super interactive. Obviously, in a group this size, I won't be able to do that. So if you do have questions, please use that link that Ryan referenced. And I will have various times where I take some of those questions. Unfortunately, I won't be able to get to all of them. And there will be certain materials that I share. And what I'll probably end up doing is by the end of the 2 days, I'll make just a really small Google Drive with a few exercises that maybe we went through that you'll have access to, and I'll make sure that gets uploaded in your PESI folder for all of you. So I'm going to jump over to our slides and we'll get going.
Don't jump on me. No. No.
Okay. So like I said, obviously, I know you're all here to learn about EMDR and figure out if it's something that you want to utilize. So we're going to go over what EMDR is, the framework of EMDR, why EMDR does and works the way that it does, how it's able to access and disrupt kind of that neural network of trauma. We're going to also look at why there's such good results with EMDR. And then we'll look at a few of the basic resourcing skills. And basically this just means fancy coping skills. But in EMDR, we call them resourcing skills, just a fancy way to say coping skills. We'll look at the basics of the EMDR model. And then we're also going to, this is where we're going to be kind of starting today. We're going to be looking at trauma and memory, trauma in the brain. And this is really going to help you understand the methodology behind EMDR. I found that clinicians tend to understand EMDR and utilize it a lot more when they have a clearer understanding of why the brain reacts and interacts with trauma the way that it does. I promise I try to keep it user-friendly, and I try to teach in a way that you can teach clients so that it makes it more understandable. We'll then get into a few, I have a few polyvagal exercises that we'll do as we kind of learn about this trauma portion of the presentation. And then we'll go into some bilateral stimulation techniques, which is one of the hallmarks of EMDR, right? And then we'll get into the 8 phases of EMDR, the 3-prong approach, and I'll show a couple demonstrations throughout the next 2 days. So one thing that I do want to say before I go into this, and this is really important for me to share with all of you, so this is kind of my disclaimer, if you will. I want you to know that EMDR is an advanced skill set. So this training is meant to be an education of a snapshot or a quick look of what EMDR is. This training does not equate to being trained in EMDR, and it's not something that I endorse as well. So EMDR is a very in-depth skill set. You're going to just get a really small glance of what EMDR is. Keep in mind that normal EMDR training is about 5 days with ongoing consultation that's about an additional 10 hours. So you're going to get just kind of a brief look of maybe what you would cover in some of those, maybe that first day or so of EMDR training. But this does not equate to that full EMDR training. This is just to provide you guys with insight and a look at what EMDR is, and a good refresher maybe for those of you that have been trained in EMDR. And I also think that this is valuable because a lot of us, we've maybe heard things about EMDR, we might not know what it is. This will really kind of help you decide if it's something that you want to seek further training in. But please know that you have to use this with caution. And so I'll be very clear about the skills and techniques that I offer that I believe require further training before they can be used. So in order for us to really understand EMDR and why EMDR works the way that it does, we have to understand trauma. And we have to understand what trauma is and why trauma impacts people the way that it does. And so I found that this is where we need to start our little journey on EMDR together, is to better understand or maybe change the framework or the lens in which we look at trauma, to understand why do we keep running into these barriers with clients? Why do we get so far and then it seems like we hit these roadblocks? And a lot of this rests within what we're going to discover of how EMDR came into existence. So you see, I've got a few questions on here, and I want you to kind of just consider some of these answers. And you can consider them from your perspective or from clients' perspectives. So what do people categorize as being traumatic? Keeping in mind that trauma, like we know, impacts all of us differently. I've recently been going through The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate, his newest book, which if you guys have not heard of him, I highly recommend that you look at some of his stuff, because he's just remarkable with trauma and addiction and a myriad of other things. But in this early chapters of The Myth of Normal in his recent book, he talks about how trauma's kind of become this catchphrase in our society, right? That trauma's kind of become this frequently used word, but in some ways it's been used to kind of delineate or mean that trauma is something that sets us apart from other people. That trauma has done something that differentiates us or separates us from others. And that trauma means that we're not, quote unquote, like normal, right? That something abnormal has happened to us. And my goal and hope as we kind of get going right now is just to challenge you to maybe expand your view outside of what trauma really is and what trauma isn't. And I also want to challenge you, kind of similar to if any of you have trained with Bessel, you'll hear him talk about the DSM a lot. And I would also challenge you to expand this viewpoint of what trauma is outside of just the DSM framework. And we know the DSM is important, but trauma is more than just, right, what happens to us. We're going to look at what it does inside of us and why it creates the barriers that it does. So think about how you recognize when trauma has occurred. And as clinicians, I really want you to consider this, because a lot of the times we might downplay our own trauma because we hear the worst of the worst all day. So how do you delineate or differentiate or tell when something's been traumatic for you or for a client? And think about how clients do the same thing. How do they know when something's been traumatic? And how much of that actually rests on our shoulders at times to provide that psychoeducation? And I also want you to think about how trauma has been portrayed in society and media. You can even think about the way trauma has been normalized, the way that it's maybe been generalized. But all of these kind of create barriers in our healing process. And one thing that I've seen quite frequently over the last decade is just how misdiagnosed trauma can be, where we'll get these clients that come in and they have a plethora of diagnoses, right? They've got like PTSD, major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and no one's really ever taken the time to provide good psychoeducation about how trauma really looks and how it can mimic and present like a variety of other diagnoses. So we're going to look at that a little bit today, because this part is really important, and it's also what's going to help us utilize EMDR in appropriate ways, but understand how EMDR works. So think about, and I asked you this kind of on this last slide, of how we internalize our experiences of trauma. So most of us know by the time that we get clients that come into our office they come in with their present day issues and concerns, right? There's things that they're struggling to get over or work past in their life. Most of the time, they might come in, they might give us a generalized view of the trauma that they faced in their life, but usually it might be difficult for them to identify maybe some of those triggers. So think about how they've internalized that, and think about, again, going back to our own experiences, how you internalize that. And typically this happens for a variety of reasons. And again, all of this, if you can kind of bookmark these ideas, are going to tie into helping you understand the framework of EMDR, because they're closely related. So a lot of the times what we're going to see is a lot of the self-blame. There's questioning their reality. Should that have been traumatic? Was it traumatic? Someone's experience was worse than mine. Why is this impacting me the way that it was? Oftentimes, again, there hasn't been that psychoeducation around what trauma is, how trauma can present, and the way that it impacts their daily lives, their brains, and their bodies. You can also think about this internalization that occurs, and I've worked with so many complex trauma survivors where trauma has been all they've known, the abnormal has been their normal, that they have not even recognized or seen the gravity of their circumstances, right? It's just become kind of normal to them. And a lot of the times what we see is that there's kind of this innate sense of not being listened to or not being heard in the past. So why would that change or be any different in the future? And one thing that I think is important to note here, and this is one of the reasons that I've come to really love EMDR, is its ability to get to the root of trauma without always having to talk about it, which we're going to learn later today. But keep in mind that maybe a lot of the internalization that occurs for some of those clients that we're struggling with is, we think of, and we've heard this phrase, right, of pre-verbal trauma, or pre-verbal trauma meaning that it happened in these early stages of development before we had the verbal capacity to say what happened. And I want you to kind of maybe think about the idea, and as we learn a little bit more about trauma today, that maybe pre-verbal trauma isn't just about early developmental trauma, but that a lot of the times the wounds of trauma that occur are pre-verbal, even as adults or in adolescence, where there's things that happen that it is hard for us to find words, to put words to our experiences, our feelings, our triggers, or whatever else has happened. I'm going to be going through some different ways that you can consider trauma as we move in today. And you're going to hear me reference back to this definition of trauma a lot. And this, again, is going to tie into, if you can kind of bookmark this, of why I feel like EMDR gets to the root of trauma. So I'm going to share with you just a couple generalized summaries of people, of how they've defined trauma. So if we are familiar with The Body Keeps the Score and Bessel van der Kolk's work, one of the ways that he summarizes what trauma is that trauma is when we're not seen or known, which is one of my favorite definitions of trauma. You might have also heard it as these automatic reactions or actions that become instinctual. And Gabor Mate describes trauma in this way, which I love, that trauma is an internal injury. It's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. And this is the whole fundamental reason around why EMDR is able to get to the root of the trauma, because of the way that trauma changes us on the inside, in our brains and our bodies, which we're going to look at. The definition of trauma that I like to use is, to me, that trauma can be anything that negatively impacts the way in which I see myself, others, and the world around me. So anything that makes me lose hope, trust, or safety, with myself, others, and the world around me can be seen as traumatic. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm saying it's like PTSD trauma, but talking about lower level trauma, where these are these more common experiences that we all have. And one of the reasons why I like to utilize this definition when I'm training on EMDR is that what we know from a lot of Francine Shapiro's work, who's the developer of EMDR, is that these experiences and the memories that form around our experiences are what give us the meaning that we hold and define about ourselves, the meaning and the way that we see others, and the meaning that we see and interact or trust the world around us. And the meaning that we give something is very important in understanding trauma, as it's likely going to depict the perceptions that we make about safety and danger, but also about the way in which we believe in ourselves, others, and again, that world around us. So trauma, and we'll come back to this frequently, again, is this idea, right, that it can be anything that really negatively impacts or changes the view of safety, security, trust in myself, others, and that larger world. So whenever I try to understand or help a client understand in the terms of psychoeducation, I like to look a lot at the root, origin, and meaning of why a word came into context. Why is this word introduced into language? And when it was introduced into our language, what was it meant to represent? And so if we look at these early roots of what trauma is, we see a couple definitions, right? A physical injury. The second one I love, a wound or a defeat. And I think about how that can be that moral injury, right? But that defeat is huge too. Or an unpleasant experience that causes abnormal stress. And we're all going to have a different definition of what unpleasant means, which is why it's important to understand that trauma is very individual and it's very different based on each of our experiences, the memories that we've built and formed. And these impairments that occur when we have these unpleasant experiences, right? Or maybe these negative defeats or wounds. We need to keep in mind, if we're looking at this first kind of definition within trauma, this physical injury, usually we have to identify what's been injured, right? So maybe we identify the extremity. Well, trauma is very similar to this. So if we have to identify the wound, what has been wounded? So going back to that definition of Gabor Mate, it might not be what happened to us, but what happened inside of us. What's become wounded inside of us? And oftentimes the wounds that occur when we're identifying where an injury is, we're trying to identify not just the region, but maybe even the organ that's been impacted. And in the case of trauma, we see that it might not just be the physical act that occurred, but what becomes wounded, right? That moral injury, maybe the psyche, the brain, but we also know that there's lasting impacts and wounds that occur in our body as well. So as I introduce kind of this root origin to you of what trauma was intended to be, if you think about this defeat and how someone might identify a defeat or a wound, think about how you can relate this back to clients or help them identify maybe what is traumatic, or think about what's becoming stuck or being seen as a wound for a lot of the people that you're treating. So as we kind of move forward in this exploration of trauma that we're doing together this morning, as we get ready to get into some EMDR later, I think it's important for us to look at the differences between complex and single incident trauma. And this is important for a couple of reasons. Is there's some differences, and then this is also an important thing to consider as we start to learn about EMDR, because complex trauma, just like with any other treatment modality, it changes the way that we might approach things in our treatment process, which we're going to look at as we get into learning about EMDR, how we would use EMDR to treat complex trauma, but also how we would use it to maybe treat some of the single or more simple incident experiences of trauma. So I want us to have just a clear, quick view of what some of this means. Again, I know some of this is a little bit of a refresher for you, but please just keep in mind that if you can hold on to this, it really is going to tie in with why EMDR is able to do what it does. So we know that there are different clusters of symptoms that occur with trauma. And we could take a lineup of people that have maybe experienced very similar traumatic experiences, and their reactions, their symptoms would all look different. So it's important for us to know that there can be these different clusters of symptoms and different presentations. And one thing as we look at complex trauma, keep in mind, is that complex to me means that it's just layered, right? There's been trauma after trauma after trauma. It's like we've taken clusters of single incident traumas that have eventually become complex trauma. It's trauma, like you see here, within more trauma. We also know that within complex trauma, there's higher likelihood of complex grief and bereavement. And one way I like that this can be differentiated, and again, going back to Gabor Mate's work, is he talks about the difference between complex, or what we reference or hear maybe in clinical terms as big T trauma, versus little t. Is he has a really nice way of explaining this. And he talks about big T trauma is when something that shouldn't have happened has occurred, and it's occurred over a longer period of time. And what we know about complex trauma is because it's layered upon layer of trauma and negative experience, what we see is that it impacts the brain in a different way, but also in a greater capacity. This doesn't mean that there's no hope for healing. Healing is always an option and always available, but there's going to be more barriers or more work that needs to be done. So I think of complex trauma kind of this way. This is when you think about, we're talking about like diabetes, right? So we could see like maybe a single incident of trauma as being maybe insulin resistant. But someone, if we were to liken this in this little example, complex could look like type 1 or type 2, right? There's layers of change that's occurred throughout a person's life. There's all of these differences that have had to occur for an ongoing period of time. And typically what we know with complex trauma is it can be really rooted in earlier experiences of childhood abuse and neglect. So usually with complex trauma, this is where we're seeing those really kind of heavy abuse incidences or acts of violence. When we look at single incident or simple trauma, what we see is that this single incident has usually occurred in maybe someone that's had more stability and less trauma in their life. This is one of the ways that we differentiate this. So this is someone that maybe has had less experiences of ongoing trauma, and then something like occurs, right, kind of out of the blue. This could be like that car accident, a natural disaster. And even though there might be layers on that circumstance, at the time that the trauma maybe starts to develop, what we kind of see with people that we want to categorize as single incident trauma is that they've typically had more experiences of regulating and healing in their past. There might have been more stability, more resources there, and they're able to kind of maybe bounce back or adapt. With complex, we see that maybe they've never had that experience to learn how to regulate or feel safe. And so we can see those lasting kind of impacts. And again, I kind of referenced this a minute ago, but if, with Gabor Mate's work, where he talks about the complex, these are the horrible, awful things that should never happen. And then he talks about the small t trauma as these being things that are universal typically. These are things that could happen to any of us, or that maybe we've all experienced to some degree. But multiple single incidences of trauma eventually lead to that complex too if they go unresolved. So we're going to get into looking at some of the presentation with trauma. And this is one of my favorite slides, honestly, to go over. And if any of you have trained with me before, you know that I like to talk about the symptoms of trauma because I think it's really important and valuable to understand the presentation of trauma. And I've learned this the hard way, probably like a lot of you have, right? Where we're kind of taught in school, and when we get into practice, and I mean, for all honesty's sake, right, we have to diagnose clients in order to be able to see them. It's required for insurance, it's required for treatment planning, all of these things. And so oftentimes it can get us to maybe use this DSM that's just based on our psyche, our mental health features, but doesn't look at the whole person as a whole and these other symptoms. And this can lead to a lot of the misdiagnosing that I talked about earlier. But it's really important, and I've learned this actually the most through EMDR. EMDR taught me and continues to teach me to see the different ways and to understand how trauma gets trapped in our body and why people react and respond the way in which they do, why they have the symptoms and the reactions the way that they do. And this isn't to mean that it's to take accountability away from their actions or behaviors, but it's helped me really understand why those responses happen, and it's helped me to have more compassion, more empathy for that presentation. So we're going to go through some of this list, and we're going to talk about some of these differences that we can often see and maybe the way that they've been misdiagnosed. So when trauma presents, there are a variety, again, of those clusters of the way that it can present, and it can mimic these different disorders. And we're going to talk about that overlap here and differentiate. So oftentimes with trauma, we know that there's a difficulty of feeling alive or being present. And this oftentimes, and we're going to look at this disconnection that occurs between the brain and the body. And so one thing that happens is when this disconnection occurs, it's very difficult for people to feel present or to feel alive, or that description of feeling numb. So it's like they're just kind of disconnected, and that's become a survival mechanism for them. This can oftentimes look like depression. So if we think about those symptoms, or someone that comes in and they present with kind of this dysthymic kind of feature, right, where just don't have excitement about life, just feeling like numb, and I just don't feel like the urge or the enjoyment out of things, it would be easy for us to categorize that as something like major depression if we didn't explore things further. The next thing that we're going to look at on this list from there can be something like where they're easily startled or upset. And we know that kind of jump response, right? And usually that kind of will make us perk up clinically and say, okay, there's something here that's causing this startle response. Something's happened that has made them be on guard. One of the ways we might minimize this, though, is when we kind of will liken, right, and have more empathy for the startle or that jump kind of reflex. But oftentimes when it is presented with emotions where they're easily upset, or maybe we see that quick switch in mood or behaviors, we think, whoa, why are they so reactive? Why are they being so sensitive? They're so on guard. They're so edgy and irritable. Like, what's going on? And we see it more as a behavioral or maybe even like a mood disorder. Could be, could not be, right? But if we're looking at this through a framework of trauma, it's also important to know that we have to look at what's causing that reaction to happen. So not only do those reflexes happen for us physically when trauma occurs, it really happens in our moods. And so this will oftentimes, I'll see this a lot where people have been misdiagnosed with like rapid cycling bipolar disorder, right? And they've been like, well, my moods fluctuate a lot. And when we're differentiating between a mood disorder and trauma, one thing to keep in mind with this is that there's always going to be a trigger that's associated when it's trauma. With mood disorders, it's out of the blue and there's nothing that's causing it. Now, sometimes from an outside perspective, we might look at this and we might say, well, there isn't anything that's causing it, but that's our perception, right? For the person that's being reactive, there's likely been something that has triggered or offset that when it's related to trauma. And we all know kind of on this next item on the list, we've heard about this a lot, especially over the last 10 to 15 years as we've expanded our knowledge around just the body and the way that the body truly does keep the score, right? So we know that stomach aches, irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune disorders, all of these things, we're starting to see this correlation with trauma and how trauma is not just something that occurs up here. It affects our entire system. We also know that it causes suppression in our immune system, which is part of the reason that there's some contributing factors to developing or being at higher risk for developing an autoimmune disorder. So sometimes those physical screenings that we're doing when they come in and we're doing our assessment, we're asking about medical things, we have to be really specific on this one of, so tell me about any medical issues, and they might say, oh, I don't have any, I've been no issues, or they've identified an autoimmune disorder. But it's really important, and I've learned how to start maybe probing a little bit more in terms of physical presentation and symptoms. And one way that I'll do that is I will ask a lot about gut health. So about, are there issues with like constipation? Are there issues with diarrhea? Did they get frequent stomach aches, headaches, muscle aches, tension, headaches, anything like that? Because a lot of the time this is telling me about the body and the way that the body's responding to their state of being, which is usually rooted back in those early perceptions of experiences that they've had, which we're going to look at further when we get down the road here in just a bit. Another thing that we're going to see with this, obviously, is there's big issues with trust typically. So there's difficulty trusting, might be us clinically, there's trust issues, or they're always maybe questioning partners or others, or maybe they don't want to open up and be vulnerable to people. If we're thinking about this from an attachment-based kind of perspective, this can look kind of like any of those different kind of attachment styles, if you will, except for secure attachment. There is usually those smaller T kind of traumas that have occurred for any of those other attachment styles that we'll see. So like insecure attachment or avoidant or disorganized. So there's kind of this difficulty, going back to my kind of definition, where it's changed the way that I see myself. So maybe I don't trust myself, maybe I don't trust others, and then I don't trust the world around me. Then we see, and we talked about this in these earlier slides, right, this tendency to kind of internalize everything, where we see that they have a tendency to kind of take on responsibility for things, or they kind of have this assumption that everything somehow is their fault or they're responsible for things. And I know that there's the new terminology going around right now, right, with that highly sensitive person, or that rejection dysphoria. And we're slowly starting to see research come out that links that to ADHD, which we're finding now the common ground that is oftentimes present between ADHD, ADD, and early signs of attachment trauma. So kind of interesting here. But one thing that we'll see with this is that there's this tendency to take on either too much responsibility for things, or this is the person that thinks maybe like everything's about them, like they've done something wrong, they've somehow upset someone, they're having to check in all the time. This is usually clearly related to some of those early attachment wounds or traumas that have likely occurred. This is another one that I think we know of and consider with trauma oftentimes, this maybe sudden sweating or heart palpitations. And what we'll see with this one, obviously, and I'm watching for this in session. And as you learn about EMDR, what you're going to find is you have to really learn how to tune into the somatic symptoms that clients present with. And so one thing that I will always watch for with this, especially when I'm looking at an increase in activation, which we're going to go through a little bit more in depth here in just a bit, is I know that the heart rate increases when someone is activated. When the heart rate increases, I know that they're going to start to perspirate, right? So they're going to start to sweat. So this might be you start to see someone like rubbing their hands on their pants, or they talk about it's really warm in here, or I'm starting to notice them perspirate around in their face, or I'm also noticing it maybe in the underarms, or this might be someone that comes in and you see a lot of perspiration that's taken place, but it doesn't match maybe necessarily the environment or temperature of the environment. So that sudden sweating, heart palpitations, those can be very common and indicative of maybe some unresolved trauma or an overactivated state. One thing that I think is interesting is I used to do a lot of work around trauma specific to how it presents and the differences with gender. So looking at trauma presentation and kind of that toxic masculinity, right? And how trauma is oftentimes misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed at times. And one thing that I used to do a lot of groups specific to like men's trauma groups. And I've seen this with clients I worked with as well, like male clients that kind of come from a long line of expectations, right? Of gender norms and gender expectations of how men should act, think, feel, and cope. And one thing that's always been interesting to me is that within that, what I'll kind of find is that once we start like working on the trauma and we start to get them to feel a little bit more present in their body, something like this will occur. And you all might be able to relate to this. They'll come back in and they'll say, I think I've been having chest problems. Like I've been noticing that my heart's been bothering me and I'm feeling it racing all the time. And I've actually gone to the doctor because I think that I'm like maybe in early phases of like, having some heart issues. And then they'll do like tests and the doctor will come back and say, oh no, it's actually just anxiety, right? But this is this first time that they felt anything in their body or been present enough to feel in their body. But those heart palpitations, that strong kind of sense of the heart like beating, can oftentimes be indicative, again, of that hyperactive nervous system. We also see, and we know this is like one of the hallmarks of PTSD, right? Is we think of nightmares and flashbacks. But one thing that I want to challenge you with is that there's a difference in sleep patterns that occurs. And it's not just with nightmares and flashbacks when we're talking about trauma. There's some other things that occur. There's a disruption in our REM sleep cycle. And then another common thing that we're going to see, and I actually will see this just as much as I see nightmares and flashbacks, is there's real issues with sleep, and it's not because of the nightmares. And it looks something like this. So this is the client that says, every morning, it's so weird. Like I'll sleep good and then I'll wake up at like 1 or 2 or 3, right? and everyone kind of has a different time that their body goes into that REM cycle, but it'll be somewhere in the middle of the night where they'll have this frequent middle of the night wakening, and they'll say, wasn't having dreams, or I don't remember them, but I'm just like wide awake and my mind is racing and I kind of can't fall back asleep, and I just have all these things on my mind. And we'll see this as a very common hallmark symptom within trauma, is that there'll be these sleep disturbances where the brain kind of doesn't want to go into a full state of rest or relaxation because it wants to stay on guard. Or during this REM cycle, which we're going to learn about a little bit later, because the REM cycle is where Shapiro really started to understand and kind of what bred some of the early development of EMDR. This is also where during this REM cycle, we do a lot of filtration. So this is where the brain filters out what's necessary, what's useful for the day, and it puts it into long-term memory stores or short-term memory stores. But when something traumatic's occurred, the brain holds on to that and it stores it in this own little neural network of trauma in an effort to keep us safe. It says, I've got to remember these things and hold on to these because they're necessary for our survival. And so the brain can't really filter those out. And so sometimes when the brain will run into some of those during that REM cycle, we can see this frequent awakening. We'll also see this when someone has been in an overactive state all the time, meaning they're just like living in hyperarousal. The body and the brain can't ever really relax. So very common to see sleep disturbances that way. We'll also see kind of this sudden change in vocal pitch changes. And we're going to learn just a little bit about the vagus nerve in a bit, because to me, the vagus nerve is really critical in kind of just understanding just a little bit of it. We're not going to go into a bunch of work around that. And if you are interested in learning more about like polyvagal theory or the vagus nerve, I highly recommend a lot of the work by Deb Dana. She's done amazing work and has a lot of really great resources around it. But this polyvagal nerve, or this vagus nerve, rather, sorry, is really fundamental in understanding the connection between the brain and the body. And we're going to look at this a little bit more here in a bit. But one thing that will happen is, as you're learning with EMDR how to cue into those body symptoms, it's important for us to know what that vagus nerve, which again we're going to learn about here in a bit, can kind of trigger. And this is going to tell you a lot about if someone is in that window of tolerance, meaning are they in a hyperarousal or a hypoarousal? We're going to be able to kind of delineate that based on some of these physical presentations, one of which is being the vocal pitch changes. So usually when there's activation or someone is aroused or triggered, if you will, what we'll see is we're going to see these changes in their vocal pitch. So this is where like you'll see really deep-throated swallows. You'll see things like they're having to clear their throat, or maybe you'll even hear it. So like voice cracking, like you're talking about something and then all of a sudden you notice that when you get to a certain point in their story, it's either more difficult for them to find words, or you'll start to hear kind of these where they lose their vocal pitch or tone, where all of a sudden now they have kind of a meek or a muted voice, or they're trying to, clear their throat before they can find those words. Very common to see that activation occur. Easily startled, we talked about this one, but I want to talk about this one in just a little bit different way. So easily startled by noises. And any of you, again, that have trained with me know this is like one of the things that I think is just so fascinating about one of our presentations of trauma. And this ties into that vagus nerve as well. But one thing that we know is that when someone is activated, and this goes, and we'll think about this with animals as well, but when we're triggered, one of our built-in survival mechanisms is we have these tiny inner ear muscles. And these inner ear muscles like when we're in a normal social engagement kind of experience like we're in right now, we're able to tune in to conversation, to vocal pitch tone. So low, we call those low frequency noises. So we're able to just kind of focus on what's going on, and we have the ability to kind of drown out those outside sensory details. So meaning like right now I'm focused on just talking to you all, but I can drown out my heater, I can drown out my white noise machine, and I'm tuned into this sense of just wanting to have connection. Well, when we're activated, where if someone gets triggered, and it can even be unknowingly, what we know is that there's these inner ear muscles, they shift when we're triggered. And when that shift occurs, they move, and what occurs is now the ears are attuned to just picking up high frequency noises. So it's difficult for them to, they're not hearing those local frequency noises anymore. So they're not listening to the vocal sounds. They're more attuned and they're picking up all those outside sounds. So this will look like someone comes into your office, right? And you notice that they're kind of like maybe on edge, a little bit activated. And this presentation with what we're talking about with how this sound changes is it will look something like this. So you're kind of asking them questions and you're noticing that they're having a really hard time kind of following the questions, that they seem kind of distracted, that they're kind of looking around, they're scanning, doing an inventory. Maybe you have to ask the same question multiple times to get a response. I'll see this a lot like in first responders that I've worked with, like police officers and military veterans. What this will kind of look like when they come in is they're highly attuned to any other outside noises. So it's like, man, your sound machine is so loud. And it's like trickling water, right? But no one else has commented on or noticed. Or I'm noticing that they can, every time a car drives by, they're instantly like turning and wanting to look out the window. And so when this occurs, this is telling me that this is someone that is either activated or someone that's used to living in kind of this high response state, right? This highly activated or this high arousal state where they're really just cued in to those higher frequency sounds in an effort to kind of stay safe. This can also look like you're home alone in your apartment, right? Maybe for the first time in a while. It's night. Now all of a sudden you're more alert to like every creak in the floor, right? Every time the like heater, the water heater turns on, like you're highly attuned to that. That's when this activation occurs. We'll also see kind of this intolerance of maybe themselves and others, where they have either high expectations for themselves, they feel like they can't achieve things, they kind of feel like this chronic failure. But there's also kind of this intolerance for others. And at the break, I'll put a really good reference on here for you if you guys are interested in this, where there's actually a really good channel that I like to follow on YouTube where he talks about this intolerance of others and these kind of these unbeknownst childhood triggers of things that can set us off. And this can be things like people that maybe like disregard us, or people that, you know, you're walking into a building and they don't hold the door open. And this is the trauma person, is the person that's like, I can't believe they didn't hold the door open. There's all these people coming in, right? And they're kind of just this reactant to this intolerance for others and not understanding how others couldn't be mindful of someone or of them. And then we'll see this intolerance of themselves where they're very hard on themselves. And a lot of times this goes back to those early attachment or early traumas that they've had. We'll also see this difficulty with focusing and concentration. We're going to look at why this occurs. And this is also going to be part of why EMDR is so effective of getting to the. Actually, all of these symptoms are important for us to understand because EMDR has a great way of targeting each of these. But we know that there's a high likelihood of like ADD and ADHD that's associated and correlated with trauma, especially early ongoing trauma. And so that difficulty with concentration and focus is oftentimes very prevalent when trauma has occurred. And part of this is because of the way that the brain develops, which we're going to look at here in just a minute. And we'll also see these kind of maybe emotional swings, kind of like talking about where we talked about that easily upset at the beginning of this list. It will look like that as well. But one of the differences is that the emotional swings, they'll appear more rapid, and they'll always again be a trigger. So if we think about with mood disorders, there tends to be like a buildup, and then they will occur maybe for a time period, or maybe the rapid cycling will just last for a time period and then it goes away. With trauma, we're going to see that almost all the time. There's going to always be a reason when it truly is traumatic that it's linked to a trigger or something that represents a past traumatic experience. We also know, and this is documented well in a lot of Bessel's work, that people that have experienced ongoing trauma either have an increased pain threshold or they can be more sensitive to it. And if you remember, if any of you again have read The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about this where he's working with veterans that have come back from Vietnam, and they do something like, I'll probably butcher this, which he would correct me on, but that's okay. Where they put their hand in like a bucket of water or something, or they're shocking it, and while they're watching videos of war and combat, and they saw that what they found is that they have a significantly higher pain tolerance, meaning that we don't notice that pain threshold like we normally would because the body's in a state of survival, right? We're numbed out from those experiences. We'll also see kind of just this reoccurring or repeating maybe kind of pattern, especially with complex trauma. When we think about those layered circumstances, what we tend to see is that the narrative of life, there's these clear patterns that occur, right? Where it's like maybe failed relationship after failed relationship, maybe similar trauma after similar trauma. And sometimes from the outside, we can look at that and we can say, man, why aren't they getting this, right? Like they're not learning from this. And I'm more curious about why, what's keeping them in that pattern. And this somehow goes back to the meaning, right, that they've given themselves, others in the world around them. What's making this feel safe or normal to repeat? We'll see a lot of these repeated kind of patterns and histories that look quite similar. So we've talked about kind of this disconnection between the body and the brain. And when this occurs, when trauma occurs, there typically is a disconnection between the body and the brain. And this is one thing that I feel like the DSM might get the brain element right with PTSD and complex trauma, but it doesn't encapsulate the full perspective of the way that the body can be affected by these things. And Jennifer Sweeten, a colleague of mine, she talks about this disconnection. I love this. And she says, when trauma occurs, there's that disconnection, right, between the brain and the body. It's like they're not even belonging to the same person. So you're either numbed out in your head and your thoughts and you're overly somatic and feeling things, or it's the opposite. You're in your head all the time, right? There's a lot of emotional and behavioral presentations, but your body, you're just totally disconnected from. It's this numb feeling, this numb sensation. And this is where we'll see a lot of things of like dissociation that occur. We know that anyone that experiences trauma regardless of the type of trauma, there's going to be some level of dissociation. We know that we all kind of dissociate to some degree on varying levels. And really, we're going to see this really strong disconnect between the brain and the body when complex trauma has occurred. And this is usually due in that effort to survive, right? So it either hasn't been safe enough for me to feel my body, and so I learn how to disconnect and numb out, or it hasn't been safe enough for me to sit and have the feelings or the thoughts that I do, so I learn how to numb those out, disconnect, dissociate. We also know too here that these visceral sensations, these somatic sensations that we have in our body and our brain, they can trigger us to get into that state of hyperarousal where we get reactive, right? So trauma, which we're going to learn about here in just a bit, is really stored in our senses. And these senses, like our sight, taste, touch, smell, sound, that's how trauma is kind of stored. And those visceral, when those sensations get triggered, those visceral sensations, they can trigger our body to go into survival mode. And some of that can be that numbing out, that disconnection, or it can be that freeze response where we're completely depersonalized. So we learn how to numb awareness to our brain and our body, because one of the things that we'll see with complex trauma is that they've learned that when there's layer after layer of traumatic circumstance, especially if this happens in early childhood, in an effort for the brain and body to survive, it learns we have to numb the awareness, right, at a subconscious level, or I'm just constantly flooded with warning signs that are making me reactive, hyper aroused. And so oftentimes one of the common things we'll see with this disconnection is that most trauma survivors, they learn to turn away from their instincts. And one of the common things that you'll hear with this, when we really know that trauma is at play and maybe we're ruling out some other disorders, is if we think back to the last slide that we just looked at, that very last one where I talked about, you'll see that repeated kind of pattern or history with someone. What we'll typically find, right, is if we really can be objective, what we'll tend to find with, maybe let's say it's a person that's had failed relationship after relationship, and we're going, why do they continue to have these failed relationships? Like, they're not getting it. So this has to be something about them, right? And maybe to an element it does, right? And maybe there's a piece of it that's about the trauma. But when we're thinking about how trauma survivors will kind of learn to turn away from those instincts and kind of disconnect and dissociate, this is very common. So oftentimes what you'll hear in that example I just gave is they'll say, when they're giving you that history, right, like, I knew that this was going to be a negative relationship, or I knew that I shouldn't enter into this next relationship. And their instincts have been right, but they haven't been honoring those instincts or feeling safe enough to trust their instincts. And I'm more curious and would challenge you to become more curious about why that's occurring. And this is what EMDR will end up getting to the root of, which I'm excited to show you how this all kind of circles back here in a bit. But that's a very common thing that we'll hear, is that there's this lack of kind of relying or acting on their instincts, because oftentimes with, again, that complex trauma, they haven't been given the opportunity to ever really rely on their instincts or to trust their instincts and to play that out. Or if they did, maybe it meant or resulted in more abuse, right, at the time. So even when we ignore stress, so if we've learned to numb, we learn to dissociate, depersonalize, whatever it is, what we know about the brain and the body now is that a stress hormone, that cortisol is still released whether we numb our experiences, we disconnect and we dissociate, On a subconscious level, even if we ignore stress, if the body is still activated, and even if we've learned to turn away from that, that stress hormone of cortisol is still released. And the more that we continue to turn away and disconnect, this is also interesting to me as well, because I'll work with a lot of trauma survivors, right, that'll come in and they'll say, well, I don't want to, like, I'm afraid that if I face this, I won't be able to handle it. Or this is how I stay safe. I don't want to give up these triggers. I like being reactive to things because it's become this perception of safety for them. But what's interesting is that we know the more that we turn away and the more disconnected that we actually are from ourselves, our brain and our body, the more in danger we actually are. So I might misinterpret and be heightened and cued into maybe certain perceptions of threat while I miss others. Where in a more like homeostasis, like imbalanced system, I'd be able to view that more objectively. So to repair this, to get the brain and the body to become in sync and to have some connection to themselves again, we have to find a way to have synchronicity in the body and in our system. And this is one thing that you're going to find that differentiates with EMDR. A lot of what EMDR does, the mechanisms of EMDR with the bilateral stimulation, is about providing this homeostasis in the brain. It's getting the brain to become in balance with itself, which we're going to look at. And you're going to see why it's able to target things the way that it does. And so I also want to just say that when we tune in or we notice that people are experiencing ongoing trauma, another common thing that we're going to see with dissociation or this disconnection is that we're going to see low facial tone and low facial responses. So they might appear really flat. So when I'm trying to objectively see how disconnected or dissociated they are, I'm watching if they mirror my facial cues. And oftentimes when there's been ongoing complex trauma, we're going to see low mirroring in some of those social engagement behaviors. Meaning when I smile, do they smile back or they stay flat? So those facial responses, in order for someone to respond that way, right? So if I smile, they smile back, or they're mimicking or mirroring like some of the facial behaviors, right, that we might have in a conversation. That, in order for those that to happen, we have to be in a state of like homeostasis, which means that frontal region of the brain has to be online. And that's where we access that kind of social engagement behaviors. But when we're in a state of stress or trauma or triggered, we're going to see that they have a more difficult time kind of tuning into those things. So we're going to do a brief little kind of tuning in exercise. And this is something that I would do early on in my treatment. And a lot of what you're going to find as we get into the phases of EMDR that I kind of want to summarize for you right now. You might be going, okay, we're going through trauma, right? Which I get that trauma relates to EMDR. But one thing you're going to find, and what essentially we're learning, is, to me, what we're covering right now is a lot of phase 1 and phase 2 work of EMDR. EMDR is built on this 8-phase model. And these first 2 phases, you spend a lot of normal psychotherapy time in. It's psychoeducation, it's history taking that's specific to trauma, it's understanding trauma presentation and looking through just a trauma lens to see what has been stuck, what their symptoms are, and what's related to it. So everything that we're learning so far is a lot of this phase 1 and phase 2, where there's a lot of psychoeducation, learning how to see things through a traumatic lens, so that as clinicians, you learn what you're going to be targeting, because it's going to be different than what we target in talk therapy. So this is important. So oftentimes, as we're providing some of this psychoeducation, in this early phase. These early phases of EMDR in our treatment with someone, trauma treatment with someone. I like to do some of these early kind of tuning in exercises. And this tuning in exercise usually goes after I talk about what we just did, this disconnection between that brain and the body. When I'm wanting to see how able they are to maybe tune in to their internal experience and how safe they feel inside their body. How able are they to kind of go inside and sit with themselves? And this is giving me a look at their responses physically. It's giving me a look at how maybe well grounded they are. And so I'm going to invite you guys to do this exercise with me. And we're going to do a bunch of exercises together. Anytime that I do an exercise with you, I really want to encourage you to just do the experience for yourself. A lot of what will make any of the skills or resources that I teach you to use them the best way that you can is if you allow yourself to have the experience first. If you get to experience it, you know what your clients experience. So all of these I will add for you as documents. So please don't worry about taking notes. I'll put all of these for you so that you have them as a resource. But just please allow yourself the time to have just this experience, right? Just like our clients would. And this is really going to help you see what can come up for clients, but also get that firsthand look of what maybe a client might experience. And we also don't really get this opportunity very often as clinicians to actually get to do some of the exercises that we teach necessarily. So please allow yourself the time to just have this experience. And like I said, I will make sure that you have the step-by-step walkthroughs of each of these, so you don't need to worry about taking notes for this. So this is just one of the basic tuning in exercises I do. So we're going to start with just taking 3 deep breaths. And I want you to breathe in through your nose and out through your nose if you can. If you need to breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth, that's okay as well. If you can't breathe in through your nose, then obviously modify and go through your mouth. But try and breathe in through your nose, and we're going to do 3 deep breaths. So go ahead, we're going to take a deep breath in. Let that go. You can hold it at the top for a few seconds. So breath in. Let that go. Last one, deep breath in. And let that go. And I'm going to invite you all to just close your eyes. And I want you to just kind of turn your mind off if you can. And imagine just tuning into your body. You're just going to explore the inner workings of your physical self. And with eyes closed, I want you to just think of what you notice first. What region or part of your body you notice. Are you noticing more internal, inside feelings or sensations? Or are you noticing more external, outside sensations? And just notice which part of your body you notice the most or feels the most comfortable to you. And then notice what there's any parts or what parts of your body feel kind of turned off that maybe you don't notice. This might be like your lower arms, maybe certain parts of your legs. Which parts do you not really necessarily think about or notice. And as you're kind of still with those eyes closed, as you're kind of just doing this body scan, I want you to think about which parts of your body feel safe to feel physically and even emotionally. Are there any areas of comfort within your body? And are there certain parts or areas of your body that also feel calm or allow you to feel more calm? Or maybe even help you know when you're calm? And continue to breathe with your eyes closed. And notice if there's any specific parts of your body that maybe let you know when you're anxious or need to be on guard. What does your body tend to do, or what does it try to tell you? How does it respond? And then are there certain parts of your body that maybe you feel more disconnected with, or that maybe you really don't like feeling? And if you can go back to that piece or that part of your body that maybe represented the calm part or the part that feels safe, I want you to just take a moment as you continue to breathe. I want you to think about if you could just expand that feeling from that piece of your body. Imagine it moving. You expand that feeling of calm in that region, peace. See if you can expand that safe region of your body to expand further. As you do this, we're going to take 3 more deep breaths in. So go ahead, deep breath in. Let that go. Another deep breath in. Let that go. Last one. Let that go. And as you open eyes or with eyes closed, I want you to kind of just like roll out the feelings, right? So that can be like rotating your neck. It can be like shaking those things out, maybe kind of just moving and awakening kind of the physical realm of your body. I want you to just think about maybe what you noticed or what came up for you. Notice if there was anywhere that maybe was more difficult to feel or connect with. You can even notice if you got distracted, what parts were difficult to tune into, what parts were easy to notice. And a lot of what we're finding here is it's helping us see maybe how easily we are able to access that internal system of ours, or how disconnected we are. But also a really good grounding exercise is to start with, before we do any type of trauma work, is working with exercises similar to this where we can get clients to kind of going inside and getting in tune with their body. The more that we can get them in tune, the more that we can get them to notice those somatic sensations or symptoms, the better able they're going to be when we get into moving into some of the trauma work that we're going to do within EMDR. So let's talk about why this disconnection occurs for a few minutes before we go to break. So part of why all of these symptoms occur, to me, there's a huge correlation with trauma and attachment, and these early attachment wounds that can occur. So when trauma occurs, especially early childhood trauma, what causes us to start not tuning into our body, our feelings, or maybe even our thoughts? We know that these early experiences of trauma or layers of complex trauma really disrupt our basic needs. And trauma at any phase in life, right, honestly disrupts our basic needs. What we know is we're born into this world that we're hardwired for two things. And those two things are survival and connection. These are innate needs that we're born with because we can't survive without connection as we're born. We're dependent, right, on the nurturing love of those caretakers that we have. So survival is not possible without connection early on. And connection is ultimately what we need for ongoing homeostasis and optimal survival. And we know that when these two things aren't met, so if we're hardwired for connection and survival, if we come in and we don't have adequate connection or support from those key attachment figures, there's going to be some major disruptive things that occur. If you see on this slide, this is actually Seth Porges' work, who's the son of Stephen Porges, who does a lot of polyvagal work. But I think this is a beautiful way of just explaining the importance of this and how it relates to trauma. So we have to have connection in order to feel attached to other people. And attachment is ultimately what makes us feel safe. So secure attachment is what leads to safety. We know it's one of the basic necessities for securely attached individuals is that they've had safe, secure attachment. And this is what allows our nervous system to feel safe. So when we have connection with others and we have secure attachment, that leads to us feeling and acting in more safe ways. And when that occurs, we know that we're more adaptable, we have higher levels of emotional regulation and higher levels of resiliency. So how this gets disrupted is, let's say, as we're born into the world, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So as we're born, the only part of the brain that's actually born intact is this back piece of the brain, that fight, flight, or freeze region. And I don't use big scientific words here because I try to use language that clients will understand, so I keep it real simple. So this back region of the brain that's responsible for our survival, this fight, flight, or freeze, is the only region of the brain that's born intact. And this is for obvious reasons. We come in and we're dependent on others. And so I have to be able to have this survival part of the brain to cry and indicate when I'm hungry or in pain so that others can respond to my needs. And we know that the brain ultimately takes, right, like 20 plus years to fully develop and reach its optimal size. But keep in mind that the brain does its largest growth in the first 18 months of life. So the brain has its largest growth period during the first 18 months of life, and it actually does the majority of its growth in those early 5 years. And then the rest of the brain will take, over the next about 20 years for it to reach its optimal size and functioning. But as that back region of the brain, as we're born and that's intact, the other regions of the brain, as they develop, they learn to be used based on how our needs are responded to and engaged, and how we're engaged with. So what this means is, let's say it's an infant, you're born into this family and it's chaotic, right? And so there's no certainty or predictability. So as this infant continues to grow, maybe there's ongoing kind of just trauma, violence, and instability in the home. Well, what happens, and we've heard this before, right? What fires together wires together. The brain will use what it needs to use in the moment, and the brain will continue to use what it's used to using. So in this scenario, this child is likely going to be having a brain that is staying engaged, right, in that fight, flight, fight region of the brain, in that survival region of the brain. What occurs is that this child learns that this is how they function and they survive. The brain hasn't had these positive experiences for it to start opening up neural connections or exercising, if you will, the other regions of the brain. Now we know that for these other regions of the brain to start to learn how to be used, similar to muscles, in order for them to be strengthened, they have to be stimulated. Well, we know that the primary way that they're stimulated in these early formative years is through our attachment relationships with others. So if we don't have safety and connected attachment, these other regions of the brain are underdeveloped. We can even see atrophying in some cases with them. And they're out of balance is typically what we'll see. But what this ultimately means is that in order for the frontal lobe to really develop and to be utilized the way that it's intended to, there has to be balance and synchronicity in both regions of the brain. So with a kid that doesn't have a secure attachment or safety, that child lives in kind of this reactive state, right? And these other parts of the brain that is going to help the child get to where it learns how to exercise problem solving, emotional regulation, concentration, doesn't get the opportunity to really develop those skills because it can't access those regions of the brain, or it has limited times where it does. And then what happens is they go to school, right? And they're maybe reactive attachment, they're oppositionally defiant, they're ADD or ADHD, and we think, we label these kids with like, well, they're not concentrating, they're not paying attention. And really their brain isn't or hasn't learned how to do that yet. They're unable to kind of have that functioning because that region of the brain has not been strengthened the way that it needs to be. So if you think about brain development this way, we know that the brain develops from the bottom up and out. So survival brain develops first, and then it slowly learns how to be used and developed if safety and security are an option and present. Then the brain will slowly develop from those regions and into that frontal. We know that the frontal lobe with our conductive reasoning logic is the last piece to develop. When attachment and connection are not met consistently, we see people maybe respond in this reactive state, but we also see fear, right? That fear seems to be everywhere. They're very highly fearful, highly on guard. So we see less security in themselves and others in the world around them. And part of what EMDR is going to do is when we can identify these early attachment wounds and the way that these neural pathways maybe have never been exercised, EMDR actually, one of the things to me that's paramount about what EMDR does is it helps the brain be able to access and exercise accessing and opening up those neural pathways on the right and left hemisphere. So it gets the brain to start practice utilizing those neural connections in ways that the brain's intended to. And if you want to see some really good evidence of this, I would encourage you all to look at, you can just Google this, right? Google what it would look, brain scans before and after an EMDR session. And what you'll see is essentially what I'm kind of talking about, this activated brain, where you'll see kind of low activation in the right and left hemisphere in the frontal lobe, and they'll be really activated in the back region of the brain. And after EMDR, what you'll see is the brain is almost lit up like a Christmas tree, where we see this neural activation taking place that's unlike any other type of trauma treatment that we can do, which is quite amazing. So during these early formative years of life, we know that these first 3 years of life in particular, and I say 3 to 5 typically, are very critical and are heavily influenced by our environment and these caregiver relationships or these attachment relationships we have. And these are pivotal in understanding the brain development. And if we understand the brain development and this attachment piece, we understand the triggers they have, why these reactions have occurred, and why they can't regulate their emotions the way that they do, which is all leading us into treatment planning for EMDR. And it's going to help us see why EMDR works the way that it does. It also impacts that psychological development and that emotional component. And we know that this is from Dan Siegel's work, that neural connections are heavily influenced by the human connections that we have. So neural connections, we can strengthen those, we can utilize those more aptly when we have stronger human connections. And these nurturing relationships, these attachment relationships we have, are directly related to our brain's ability to experience joy, desire, and motivation. So motivation is actually decreased or diminished when someone lives in an activated state all the time. When they're in hyperarousal, motivation kind of goes out the window. Attachment is one of the primary things that leads to a lot of healing. We know this even within trauma. But we also know that these first 3 years of life, this is pivotal in that brain development. And one thing to keep in mind here, what this doesn't mean is that, okay, well, they didn't have these secure attachment relationships. They had these early ongoing traumatic experiences. Healing is always possible. The brain is amazing. The brain, which we're going to learn about some of the work within EMDR, is that the brain has this natural adaptive resolution inside of it, which in EMDR we call this adaptive information processing, where the brain has a natural ability to heal. Like neurogenesis, you can think of it that way. And that even if these early attachment periods weren't met, there's still work that we can go back and do with things specifically like EMDR that can really heal and do some good work on helping the brain learn to access and utilize regions of the brain that maybe it hasn't utilized before. So even though these early relationships are going to determine a lot of the context with not just our neural development, but how we see ourselves, others in the world around us, the brain is capable of healing and adapting and resolving. And you can see this with one of the things that makes EMDR so effective in research-based and evidence-based is by looking at the brain scans of what we see after EMDR has been received for different periods of time. You see the way that the brain is able to access function and fire in these new ways that maybe it hasn't before. So the way that we connect with others, the relationships that we form, regardless of the time of life that we form these or engage in these, are also pivotal in what's going to help our brain learn what pathways it takes and what information it interprets as useful or not useful. And one thing to keep in mind with this, and this is a common example that I utilize, is when we think about that the brain uses kind of, what it's used to using, what it's fed. So when we have like secure relationships, a child's able to get out of that fight, flight, or freeze system, and they're able to access that right and left hemisphere of the brain, right, which we're going to look at a little bit more after the break. But the brain will really, again, going back to that, what fires together wires together. There's a lot of truth in this. And I share kind of this personal experience where I got to really learn and understand this. I have a son, my oldest son is 14, and he was born with optic nerve hypoplasia. And so what this means is that his optic nerves never fully developed while he was in utero, and his pituitary gland also didn't develop because they're all kind of interconnected. And so when he was first born, we had to go and do all these MRIs and brain scans at Children's Primary in Salt Lake, and they were looking at if the midline of the brain was born intact, which it was. And then they were trying to get a look at these optic nerves to see, in terms of these neural pathways that would be used with him, what his vision would likely be. And so as we were going through all these early tests and all these different things, what they had told us is that both of the optic nerves were severely underdeveloped. And the one was more developed than the other. And I remember the doctor telling us early on that at one point, the brain would quit using the eye that was more underdeveloped, so that eventually the brain would just turn it off and he would no longer even be light sensitive in that eye. And he kind of explained that the brain is going to use what it's getting the most input from, and things that it's not getting as much input from, it's really not going to use. And I thought, well, that's weird because it's still light sensitive. Why would that happen? And then here we are 14 years later, and he really is not even light sensitive in that eye anymore because of the amount of stimulation that the other eye got. The brain was focused on using just that neural input that was coming from that. So really clear, this was a clear explanation to me of really, okay, the brain really will use what it's used to using, and those things that it doesn't get as much stimulation from, eventually the brain won't use those things and won't access those things. So there's ways that we can target this within trauma, where we can help someone practice or open up those neural pathways that are going to allow them to access these different regions of the brain a little bit more aptly. So we're going to go ahead and take our first break. We'll be back 5 till the top of the hour. I'll be taking a few questions from you guys, and we'll be going through some of those questions in discussion. So if you have anything that you want answered, send it over the break, and I'm happy to answer this, or anything that you put in there. Try to get to some of them. I'm sorry that I can't get to all of them. And I hope that so far this has been useful and helpful. And I'm excited for you to all learn how this kind of nicely is going to wrap up into helping you really understand what EMDR is going to do for you and your clients. So thank you for attending, and we'll see you back in 15 minutes, about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. Thanks. All right, I appreciate the questions, so please send them in if there's anything you want clarification on, and I'm happy to get through those so that you guys feel like you're getting what you need out of this.
Perfect. I'm going to jump in with the first one.
Yeah, go ahead.
First question, what is the difference between the earlier EMDR and newer versions of
So what I'd say is initially EMDR was really developed around treating PTSD. And what we've seen now over 30 plus years of research is that EMDR is effective at and evidence in research to show that it's available and able to treat and have really great outcomes with a variety of mental health disorders, from addiction to even there's like a pain protocol to elements of grief to all kinds of different ailments that you might see clients struggling with. So that's one of the biggest things, but we'll explore that more as we get going later today.
And then this is probably an important one that lots of people are thinking about. But even before you get started with this, when you're considering using EMDR with a client, how do you know that they're even a good fit?
Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is, as we've been going through what you guys have seen so far this morning, the psychoeducation. So I use little gauges like things like that, kind of guided imagery within the body. Like, how are they responding to that? Are they able to stay present and be kind of not just present, but able to practice or go into some of the exercises that you're trying to teach them? Or do they avoid those? Are there other barriers that get in the way? A lot of those are really going to help us kind of identify who's going to have the most progress. So when we see a lot of resistance, there's usually other work that needs to be done. But we're going to talk more about how to rule some of those out and who it's going to be the most appropriate for. But those are some of the early first kind of things that we're looking for.
And there's a couple of trauma related questions here. One person wrote, where do we place relational trauma that occurs later in life? So perhaps they had a stable childhood, but a traumatizing relationship later in life, is that also categorized as a complex trauma?
Yeah, I think it can absolutely be a complex trauma. One thing that comes to mind for me when I was reading this question is I had a client that pretty like seemingly stable, secure kind of life up until about her mid 50s. Her husband got died in like a freak motorcycle accident, and she calls this like these microcosms of trauma that occurred from that loss, where it's like this huge relational loss, but then it was lifestyle loss, it was parenting, co-parenting loss. And so those later traumas, even if it starts as single incident or like with this question, those ongoing relational issues, those can absolutely become and develop into complex trauma.
And here's what I think people are wondering. Folks who are watching who are not currently trained in EMDR, you've made it clear, you're not going to walk out of here in 2 days. It's a complicated thing. They want to know, is there anything, are there going to be some things they can use that we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be really clear about the things that you guys can use. Some of the resourcing skills that we'll teach, even this tuning in exercise, some of the polyvagal exercises, some of the other resourcing exercises. I think even if you don't go on and utilize EMDR, these are skills that you're going to want as just part of your toolkit and as options for grounding, resourcing, coping skills. So yeah, and I'll be really clear about what those are. It's going to be more when we get into like the advanced, what we think of an actual EMDR, like trauma processing session, that you need more training with.
Perfect. And then there were a couple of folks asking about kind of this world now where we're not always face to face in this environment, and wondering, should EMDR be reserved for in the room, face to face, or are people using it over the top?
Yeah, honestly, I would say that there's a lot of leaders in the field within the EMDR world that had actually been using EMDR via telehealth prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has really made us be more clear about risks and limitations with utilizing it in an online or a virtual space. But there's a lot of even really good research that supports how the fidelity of the model still works well. I use it virtually all the time, and I think it does just as good of work. Sometimes I like it almost a little bit more because you're seeing people's true kind of symptoms or presentations in real world kind of scenario versus like, you know, the buildup of coming into the office where they get to come in kind of present. So I think it's just as effective. There's some good, I'll add them to the resource list for you guys of telehealth resources related to EMDR that will be helpful. And when we get into learning the different types of bilateral stimulation, I'll show you and talk about how to acclimate each of those for virtual settings.
We had a few who were asking about dissociation and desensitization, and just a quick snippet again of what those are and how those present.
Yeah, so dissociation, I mean, I think of dissociation just kind of the way that it sounds, right? Like disconnected is what I think of dissociation, where we've kind of gone into like la la land or we've disconnected. We're not seemingly present. So whether that be, I think dissociation can occur like somatically, like we're disconnected from our bodies, but it can also, the way that we use it clinically, right, is dissociation is like where they tune out and they're not even here anymore. Like they're in some other, you know, thought or some other association or kind of almost like extensive daydreaming, if you will. But dissociation really means that they're ultimately in a place of being completely shut down. So, meaning they're outside of their window of tolerance and they're in ultimately that back region of the brain where they're in kind of that flight or kind of freeze response where they're just, no one's kind of home and it's difficult to keep them in the present moment.
And in that vein of things you follow as people try to jot things down quickly, you'd mentioned a YouTube channel about the symptoms of trauma, and people want to know what
Yeah.
that was. They want to follow too.
So I'm going to make a list for you guys, and it will have a list of all the books and any of those YouTube channels. And I'll add that by the end of tomorrow. So it's all in one place for you guys. And that will be one that I add to that. But if you're interested in the one I'm talking about particularly, it's called 6 Unknown Childhood Trauma Triggers. And I'll put the direct link for that channel there. But if you put that in, it will directly go to the episode that I was referencing, which I highly recommend. It's by an LCSW that does a really good job of explaining some of the early childhood trauma and how those present as adults later. But I'm going to add that to that resource list for you.
It's something good to look forward to, folks. We have extra stuff. You guys love stuff. So wait, you'll get some additional stuff from Megan at the end of this. Two more probably we got time for. One was someone said, kind of with respect to trauma symptoms, could you please speak to the unexpected touch presentation?
Ooh, unexpected touch. Yeah, that you saw in there. So having a startle reaction to that, where you can see unexpected touch can trigger, right? Like that fight, flight, or freeze response. And I'm assuming this is, whoever asked this is kind of what you're meaning. But again, that can trigger that like sensory arousal where if there's been unexpected or unwanted touch in the past that's related to trauma, if someone with that experience has someone come and approach them. Like I have a client where she had some sexual assault as a teenager, and this has been one of the symptoms that she struggled with. If her husband comes up behind her and she can't see him and he puts his hand on the back of her neck, she'll have kind of that startle response because it's that unknown, and her body responds to the trauma at that time. And so we've done a lot of good EMDR work with her, and it's really de-escalated the response to that.
And last one, you guys did the kind of the tuning in, the body scan exercise. And here this individual was wondering, how do you navigate this exercise for people who have chronic pains? When maybe they're asked to focus, feeling that stuff,
Yeah.
and pain is worse.
Such a great question. One of my favorite kind of clinicians and go-to for chronic pain is a clinician by the name of Mark Grant. And he's actually done a lot of work in the field of EMDR related to chronic pain and chronic health conditions. And he uses this example where he talks about a lot of the times, like whoever wrote this comment, this is a very common response, right? When we do kind of body scans or tuning in exercises, where people with maybe chronic pain or chronic health conditions will say that's almost overwhelming. And he talks about this idea that pain, even physical pain or chronic pain, it can also get kind of trapped in our nervous system as well. And so one of the things that he recommends doing is describing the pain in different ways. So making it more abstract. So what would the shape be of the pain? Would it have a specific sensation like prickly? Would it have a certain color? How does the pain move or radiate? Is there a message that the pain is trying to communicate with you? And he talks about the more abstract you can be with targeting that, that sometimes it can help unlock part of that nervous system. But he's actually come up with some really specific EMDR protocols and approaches to really target it. But even with chronic pain, I still think it's a good exercise to do, as it tells us where maybe some of those symptoms are locked, even related to chronic pain, and where we can maybe do some work with creating some alternate like resources for them if things like body scans, cause too much discomfort with them, which we'll talk about because we're going to see some different exercises that aren't just related to what we feel inside.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Megan, for taking the time to answer. Please keep the questions coming, and I'll hop back on next time it's time answers.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Thanks for letting me close my blinds too, you guys, even though that one's still going to drive me crazy. But thanks for letting me be a real person and do that for a second. So I'm going to jump back over to our slides. Really great questions that I appreciate. And I'm excited for you guys to see how kind of this is all going to tie nicely together with what we're going to learn here coming up. Okay, so where we left off is within this, talking about this brain development, why this matters. Why does this matter within EMDR? And to me, understanding this brain development piece is really one of the paramount parts of understanding how and why EMDR works the way in which that it does. So not understanding the brain development like we talked about, meaning the brain developing right from the bottom up and out, but also understanding what the differences are in how a healthy, and I hate to use the word healthy here, but maybe a more stabilized or someone with a more secure attachment history, the way that I guess a healthier, right, brain would look versus a traumatized brain. We see some very clear differences. So kind of like I described earlier when I encouraged you all to kind of Google a brain before and after an EMDR session, and what you'll see is before, typically you'll see that overactive rear region of the brain. We're going to look at a brain scan here in just a second to kind of really show what this will look like. This is what you'll see in the traumatized brain. And a healthy brain will see nice activation and balance and use in multiple regions of the brain. So we see more of that kind of balance and ongoing overall kind of lighting up different neural circuitries. So there's not just one primary region where there's more activation. So keep in mind that a couple of things that are important for us to understand with just basic brain basics here. And to me, this is something that I think is important for clients to understand as well, because as we know, we either get those clients that are overly emotional or we get the clients that are more logical thinkers. And what we tend to see with trauma is with people that have had ongoing complex trauma, there tends to be like a more overactive right hemisphere in their brain. So we tend to see like this creative more emotional kind of reactions and less logic. So the the right hemisphere, right, this is responsible for creativity. This is also the region that takes in our experiences. This is where we interpret and elicit body language. Same thing with sound, touch, smell. And again, it tends to be more activated with people that have had complex trauma. We also see this as one of the first parts of the brain that kind of starts to develop in utero. So when we look at in utero kind of brain development, this right hemisphere will be the hemisphere that develops first. And it's really dependent on nonverbal cues and comfort. So this is a lot of that social engagement, learning how to mirror and respond and read other people, the emotional kind of part of our brain. And then the left region, or the left hemisphere of our brain, is responsible for this logic, right? Problem solving, learning. Also aids with concentration, fact recall, helps you organize. And it also allows us to put things with a beginning, middle, and an end. It's part of that organizational system in that left hemisphere. There's also another really important component of the hemisphere called this Broca region of the brain. So this Broca region of the brain is responsible for putting words to our feelings. So it's what allows us to verbalize our experiences or describe our experiences or our feelings. Now, if we back up to what I said about maybe expanding what pre-verbal trauma could really mean, of how sometimes parts of the brain are impacted where it's difficult for us to find words to put to them. One thing to keep in mind with this is that oftentimes it's difficult for trauma survivors to find words or to put words to their experiences or to their feelings. Well, if we're working with someone that recently went through trauma or has lived in hyperarousal for a lot of years, and they're in kind of this hyperactive nervous system, what we know is they're kind of operating in this back hindbrain and in that right hemisphere. So what that tells me is that their ability to access and problem solve through things, give us a beginning, middle, and an end, and also to put words to their feelings and experiences is impaired or likely offline. And this is where EMDR is going to come in. It's going to be really helpful in us being able to give them a different way to experience it other than words. This is, to me, also why things sometimes like talk therapy get in the way of trauma treatment, because sometimes if we're working with clients and they're activated, they're triggered, or whatever it is, a lot of the other modalities that we might use require talk therapy, right? And if that region of the brain is impaired or inhibited, they're just not going to be able to do that. They can't access that, right? So CBT is going to be really good skills that can be utilized after we've done some good trauma work. Then we can go back in and maybe teach some of these other regulation skills or these other cognitive behavioral techniques that might be a little bit more responsive once their brain has learned how to regulate a little bit more, or even access that left hemisphere more than it's possibly been able to. So if you think about this, can also be, when people that have experienced trauma, we hear this a lot where it's like they feel like it, they might describe like, it feels like I'm losing my mind, or I have like no control of myself, like I'm acting impulsively or reactively. Again, usually it's because we're seeing this impairment that occurs on the left hemisphere that would naturally help aid them in like slowing those responses, right? So in a healthy brain, we're in a brain that has reached like its optimal capacity. What we tend to see, we're in a more resource brain. We see this nice kind of balance, or it's like a teeter-tottering act between the right and left hemisphere. So it goes between logic and emotion, right? And they kind of communicate to each other. And they have to have this ongoing communication for the brain to really delineate and draw from all of its experiences and make kind of these healthier decisions and have healthier responses, but also to be able to concentrate and all of that other stuff. Okay, so now what, right? Why does this matter in understanding? Why does this matter in understanding trauma, and what is this going to help us do within EMDR? So just know that within this piece of understanding the way that the brain functions when we've experienced trauma, maybe some of the deficits can be there. It might change the interventions, which is something that I like about EMDR, is because EMDR works from this framework of, I know that maybe there's some deficits there that are taking place in the neural activity of someone that's experienced or endured trauma. And so my approach has to be different than talk therapy, and EMDR is very different than that, which is nice because it kind of gives us this side door approach to being able to get in and kind of do some back work, meaning we're creating these new neural pathways, we're stimulating some new neurogenesis to kind of open up these, open up like neural access to like the right and left hemisphere. And so when we think about trauma and why this is important, remember that when people have endured trauma, that self-awareness piece that's critical for us, like having emotional regulation, is not intact or online when we're in a trauma state. And so this is why sometimes the direction or purpose when we're treating trauma can be difficult, right? We end up treating kind of the crisis of the week, and we can't figure out why they're kind of repeating or making these same mistakes or repeating these same patterns every week, what's taking place. And this is a lot of the time because that self-awareness is not online. So there's some different things that we can do to kind of activate some of these ways that we're going to start working to get them more online or more in sync with their body. And so we're going to talk about a couple different ways that we can do this, because first and foremost, as we get into this work of implementing some of these EMDR skills, we have to start with trying to create safety, not just in our clinical environment, but we have to start to teach them safety within themselves. So they have to be able to learn and feel safely inside kind of their body and even inside their brain, or to at least feel safe enough to sit and be observant of what's taking place, which oftentimes we haven't been able to do that. And oftentimes this is difficult with someone who's maybe like just functioning from their right hemisphere, like this emotionally driven kind of brain, and they're not having that nice congruence of information between right and left hemisphere. So there's some ways that we can kind of stimulate early on the nervous system that's going to help the brain start to fire neurons on both the left and right hemisphere. And when we stimulate the nervous system this way, which is going to be similar to some of the bilateral stimulation techniques that we're going to learn that are specific and relevant to EMDR, this is ultimately, right, causing these neural pathways to start opening up. And what we're seeing is that we're getting activation in the left, the logic, and activation in the right, this emotional and creative side. And it's creating that balance when we can stimulate both of those. So some early ways we can do this when we're doing maybe body work or early grounding exercises before we get into the actual trauma is by adding things like tactile stimulation. So maybe it's giving them something that they can tactile, that has a lot of different tactile texture with it that they could feel and describe to you. This is also a good one, whoever asked about pain. If you want to help them move the mind or shift the mind from the pain, using tactile stimulation this way of having something that they either rub between their hands or a different texture in each hand that they have to describe the texture. the feeling, the sensations it provides is also another good way to get them to start to safely feel inside their body. This is also an important one for clients that have like high levels of dissociation, because we oftentimes will need kind of those abstract kind of tools that are going to help them learn to feel sensations in their body without having to hit on a trigger or something else that might shut them down. This can also be like soothing sounds. So this can be, we're going to learn about like bilateral sound that you can use, but this could also just be, think about what you would listen to maybe when you go and get a massage, right? Like it could be like waves or birds or something that would elicit a sensation of safety, but that they would hear this way, and having them describe what that sound is like and what all different sounds they can hear. What are the differentiations? They could describe like the changes in pitch and elevations in tone. All of these things are pulling kind of from both sides of the brain. Smelling certain strong or different scents. So our olfactory is a really good way to access and trigger what we're going to learn about, like this vagus nerve, but it's also really imperative, and it can help be calming as long as it's a safe scent. It can also be triggering, right? So having certain different scents that they can smell and describe to you. Olfactory is a really great way to access. And then we're going to learn some of these bilateral techniques here shortly within the model of EMDR, and all for you guys, and we'll talk about this more later, but this bilateral stimulation techniques, all it essentially means is bilateral, right? We're stimulating the right and the left side of the body. And there's different ways that we're going to do this. Obviously, this was first done through those eye movements, which has given EMDR the hallmark for its name, right? But we're going to look at different ways and different forms of bilateral stimulation you can use, because EMDR is not just about using eye movements anymore as a form of bilateral stimulation. There's a variety of different ways that we can create bilateral stimulation that really are going to assist in processing, and keeping in mind that everyone processes differently, so everyone will respond differently to different forms of these kind of bilateral stimulation. So use what works for clients and client preference. One of my favorites to do in this phase is diaphragmatic breathing. This is another good one. Those of you that maybe are interested in some of the chronic pain things, depending on where the chronic pain is and if you're able to do this. This one is one of my favorites. So diaphragmatic breathing is just hands above the head. What this does is it forces the diaphragm to open up. And when our diaphragm is forced to open, it triggers the brain to say we need more oxygen. So when we need more oxygen, it's also telling the brain that we're in a state of calm, and it's going to start releasing oxytocin and dopamine to kind of calm us down. So go ahead, and as you're here, if you can do this one with arms above your head, we're going to take 7 deep breaths in. You can go in through your nose, out through your mouth if you want. We're going to pause at the top. If you can't do arms above your head, just imagine, if you can, putting arms behind your back. So kind of like you're opening up your shoulders. That way can work as well. But you'll see me do it this way. So we're going to do 7 deep breaths. And I want you to just notice what changes in your body. So you might just do a quick body scan, notice any like anxiety, tension. So we're going to go ahead, take a deep breath in with me. Let that go. In for 2. Let that go. In for 3. Let that go. In for 4. Let that go. In for 5. Let that go. In for 6. Let that go. And in for 7. Let that go. And same thing, kind of do a body scan for me. Sometimes after I'll take my arms down, or depending on which pose I do, I'll find that I want to take another big deep breath. So notice if you needed to do that. And what this is ultimately triggering is kind of, again, like I said, it's allowing oxygen to get down into more of our internal organs. It's also activating a more overall sense of calm, again, releasing kind of that oxytocin and dopamine, those feel-good chemicals. So just notice what shifted for you. Sometimes people will say, like, maybe feeling more lightheaded and they feel more sensations in their body. And sometimes that lightheadedness or dizziness can even be if you're coming off of feeling like really maybe on edge or anxious. Sometimes that opposite switch can be like they're just a little bit calmer and not as worked up in emotions. So we're going to be doing these early kind of grounding exercises as we're building up tolerance for getting into trauma processing within EMDR. So all of these are skills that we're going to be kind of utilizing and teaching along the way as we're gathering information about their kind of past experiences and everything that we're doing this way. So we're going to talk about kind of why this and how we're going to create this sense of safety, because we've been talking a little bit about attachment. But again, where some of the trauma really gets stuck is sometimes we get honed in on the experience, right? What happened. And I want you to go back to, it's really about this experience of the way that it's changed the way I see myself primarily, and the way that I see others in the world around me. But what we want to look at here is part of the meaning that we give things is what's going to ultimately make them more or less disruptive. And so we're going to have to go back, and you're going to see this within EMDR. We have to go back and work on some of these perceptions. And a lot of that means we're going back and we're doing some early kind of childhood trauma work. And so I like to get a feel for the extent of how trustworthy that maybe they feel others are. If they feel like they can support or expect support from others, if they feel supported by others. Who's it been safe to express emotions around? And this one's huge, right? So if it's never been safe to express emotions or feelings, then we need to be really patient with what we expect them to do. One of the things that I think is really nice about EMDR is that they don't have to express everything. EMDR is a very individualized, client-based experience where they get to share as much or as little as they choose to about what they feel and experience inside. So oftentimes that can create a lot of safety and a feeling of like choice for what they want to share. But again, the perceptions that form around this is their worthiness. So these early experiences are going to determine, do I trust myself? Do I feel worthy? And not just worthy, but am I worthy of receiving things like attention and love? Am I good enough? Is it safe emotionally for me? When we feel safe, or when we start to feel safe with others in these early attachment relationships, we're more likely to be able to attune or attach later in life. If we don't have any memories of feeling safe, the receptors in the brain that lead to kind of this social engagement, like our ability to connect and attune with others, don't develop as readily because we haven't accessed those, right? And so it's more difficult for us to accept even things like human kindness when that happens. So one thing that we need to see during this piece, as we're kind of exploring some of these early experiences, as we're learning to understand trauma through each client's lens that we see, is we need to remember that there's some level of impairment that's occurred at each age that they've experienced those big traumatic experiences. So what this will oftentimes look like is maybe you have a client, right, who like in their mid-adult years, but when they get triggered or activated by certain things, they tend to have like this really maybe like regressed emotional response to things. And it's usually somewhat because trauma gets stuck at kind of the age it was developed, right? And typically what we'll see is they'll kind of have an emotional reaction or a response that is indicative of the age that the trauma kind of occurred at. And so typically we have to go back and do some work with that, which we're going to look at how to do that within EMDR, that does a really nice job of working with the person of where they're at with the trauma instead of expecting them to react and respond from the perspective of now, if that makes sense, which we're going to look at a little bit more. And we learn safety because the safety piece is really important, because without safety, we can't really do any good trauma work, but especially we don't have safety, we're not going to be able to do EMDR with clients. And we learn safety from these early experiences as well. So we observe others in our environment, we decide how we're going to interpret others, and these neurons form connections or memories, if you will, and they learn to interpret intentions as well as actions based on these primary earlier experiences. So if our early needs aren't responded to, if our basic needs aren't met, we're going to respond to things that do help us survive and that do soothe us, right? And that can be in any myriad of different ways, right? It could be the kid that checks out and reads endless amounts of books. It could be in the forms of substances and addictions. It could be video games. It could be relationships. But there's going to be these coping skills that we see that have been things that have helped them survive. And we need to see those things through that lens, that these have been survival mechanisms for them, even though they're maladaptive. And we talked about this kind of idea of brain scans earlier, and looking at what a healthy versus a traumatized brain kind of looks like. And I wanted to give you guys a good picture of this. This is a common infographic that I use quite frequently from the CDC. And what we see here is this is, we're looking at a kiddo's brain, and we're looking at this PET scan of the brain. And there's a couple of things that I want to draw attention to that happens in this earlier brain development. First thing I want you to notice is we see these are the same age brains. We see that overall this brain is a little bit more atrophied in different ways. And a couple of things that we see is these dark regions. What we want to note here is that these darker regions don't mean that those parts of the brain are dead or like not intact. It means that those are regions of the brain that are not being accessed and utilized. So there's not any neural activity that's taking place in those. And the red region means that this is the most active portion of the brain. So typically in a healthy brain, what we want to see is we want to see what we see here on the left, where we see lots of nice coloring all throughout the brain, but we also see a balance kind of in the left and right hemisphere, and we see a lot of activation in the frontal lobe. And all of these regions are imperative and important for healing to really occur and for us to get into that adaptive resolution and processing system that we're going to look at within EMDR. But what we see in a traumatized brain is we see that the most active region of the brain is this rear portion of the brain, this fight, flight, or freeze response. And then we see very limited activity in the right and left hemisphere and the frontal lobe. And so we see that there's real measurable evidence of how some of these things can occur and why they have the impact that they do. So now that we kind of understand this brain component, we're going to move into the connection between the brain and the body. And we're going to get into some of this vagal nerve stuff before we get into the EMDR component. And I promise, again, this is all going to really tie together for you and really help you understand why EMDR is doing what it does when we get into this. So I found it really pivotal to understand the vagus nerve, specifically for doing trauma work, but really, again, within EMDR, this has really been helpful. So what we know is that there's this, what we call this polyvagal connection. And I think of the vagus nerve as ultimately the communication line or the pathway between the brain and the body. So it's how the brain and the body connects and communicates with each other. It's also the roadway that tells the brain and the body how to react and respond. So when the brain feels calm and when the body feels, or if the body feels calm, this can activate the vagus nerve. So if our body is feeling, maybe we trigger a sense of calm in our body, this will send kind of this message up to our brain that says, hey, release more oxytocin or dopamine, and it will trigger this kind of calming response. Or if the brain maybe starts to feel a little bit more calm or safe, we might have the same experience. Like, hey, I'm feeling calm or safe subconsciously, right? And it will release oxytocin and dopamine. When it's activated, this is also the pathway that tells our brain and our body to get ready to respond and react. And so when this is activated, this will tell the brain to start producing more cortisol, and it will release cortisol into all of these major internal organs that we have. So the vagus nerve runs by all of these and directly to all these major internal organs. So it goes by our vocal cords, which is part of why when we talked about that symptom of trauma, listening for vocal pitch tones, you're going to see this a lot in the demonstrations that we see with EMDR today and tomorrow. So we're going to see that activation that occurs like deep swallowing, and then it goes into our lungs and our heart. So this is what tells our heart to start beating faster. It delivers that kind of dose, right, of adrenaline and cortisol that speeds up our heart rate. And then it also goes down into our gut and into all those other major internal organs. So if we're constantly flooded with cortisol, that stress hormone kind of telling us to be on guard, being ready to react, this is also part of the reason why we see some of those symptoms that we covered, such as like the ongoing perspiration, why we also see things like gut health that might be poor or irritable bowel syndrome. And anytime we have higher levels of cortisol, our immune system also decreases, right? Its ability to fight off things. This increases our heart rate, all these other things. So there's ways that we can access or trigger this vagus nerve that can help it start to calm down and get us out of an activated state. And so this vagus nerve has kind of these different connected responsibilities. So it can keep us calm and send us into social engagement. It can prepare us, kind of get us on alert, right? get us a little bit triggered before we are activated. It's kind of the yellow light region. Or it can completely lead us to collapse, shutting down, or responding. So the brain and the body can communicate and tell each other either direction what to respond to or how to respond. The vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body, and it can also help us orient. It can help us, it's one of the main things that you can access and activate that's going to help us feel calm. It's also going to be really pivotal in telling me if someone's inside the window of tolerance or not, which we're going to look at when we get into some of these exercises. So there's some different roles of the vagus nerve that we're going to look at. So the vagus nerve, I talked about it going by all these major internal organs. We also know that it's linked to that back brain stem. It goes by those inner ear muscles, which is what triggers, right, that switch in hearing. But it's also linked to our taste. So one thing that, this is actually an interesting one that I learned in doing RTEP training, which is like a group and crisis response form of EMDR. And they use this exercise that's called like earth, wind, fire, air. And they talk about when we're in a trauma response, what happens is within our taste buds, we actually quit producing saliva when we're in high arousal. So it'll be like dry mouth. So one of the things that they have you do in this exercise is they'll have you produce as much saliva as you can in your mouth, like just sitting there. And it actually is a way that targets and accesses and triggers that vagal nerve to kind of kick in and trying to get it to produce more oxytocin or get it to kind of calm down. It also goes by that throat, the larynx, our voice box, and then our heart and all those major internal organs. This is what activates us, but this is also what calms us down. So we want to know, because a lot of the times with triggers, it can be difficult for clients to identify what the trigger was. So what was causing the trigger? How do we know what to target? How do we know what's safe to target when we get into trauma treatment? This is a common thing I get asked about specifically within EMDR is how do you know what to target? And part of how you're going to know that is by really starting to identify what their bodily responses are. So we might have a few triggers that we know off the top of our head, right? That it's like, oh yeah, I know that I get triggered whenever I see like this red truck because a red truck was what hit us in this really bad accident or whatever. But then there's some other things that we might not be as aware of that are triggering. So one thing that I like to have clients do in these early phases is when they get triggered outside of session, I want them to do a sensory kind of dump list for me. So what were they smelling when it happened? What did they see? Was there anything they noticed they heard? And I'm going to start looking for patterns in what they're identifying and reporting as triggers. And these are going to be important for us to target when we get into our work within EMDR, which we'll look at why when we get into EMDR this afternoon of how this kind of relates back to that. So you can also look for when they're in session, what parts of their story, when they start to tell you about their week or when they start talking about their history, where do you start to notice them tighten up in rigid states? So where do you see them clench their fists, maybe pull their legs in? Where do you see their shoulders tense up? And starting to identify those physical responses and what specifically made them kind of do that clench response. What was leading to that? And vagal nerve exercises are probably some of my favorite early interventions to do as I'm preparing for EMDR, because these are really good grounding exercises. I know that if someone can't feel safe in their body, first and foremost, there's no way they're going to be able to do EMDR. So that doesn't mean that they have to necessarily identify like feeling completely fine and having no symptoms. That's not what I'm talking about. But that they're able to kind of practice some of these skills when they are in a heightened sense of arousal, and that they're able to have little snippets of time where they do feel safe in their body. So if some of these earlier exercises or interventions like aren't working or too triggering or activating, that's telling me that we need to do more kind of body work, more grounding work, maybe more breath work, because we have to be able, we're going to ask them in EMDR to be kind of exposed to kind of increased tolerance levels that are kind of disruptive a little bit. And so we have to have things that we know are going to work to help them get regulated. So if these early regulation skills aren't working, then we're not going to move forward with doing any more EMDR until they can kind of regulate and practice some of these skills. This part is really important to me. So even if that's just breath work, and again, I want us to find things that work specifically for that client. So if you find an exercise that works, use it every single time. Get them in the habit of practicing it rather than it just being a checkbox and moving on to finding another skill. Use and stay with what works and continue to have them practice this, because that's going to be really pivotal in your success with trauma treatment. But you're also doing some really good neural work there, and you're going to be able to really help them ground and get regulated when you work through some of the harder stuff. So we're going to do a couple different vagal nerve exercises, because I think that this vagus nerve, and I want you to have the experience of doing these, because it really shows you the power of the vagus nerve and how true it is that there actually is this, this nerve in our body that connects our brains and our bodies together, that activates us, but that can also calm us down. So this is what I think is important for us to kind of just see how this works. And testing these things out is also what helped me become a believer in some of these things and within EMDR. So again, I'm going to put links to each of these things that I teach you. So please note that I will make a resource list for you guys that will have these exercises too. So please just let yourself have the opportunity of doing these exercises and just getting to experience them so you can see what it does for our clients. And then we'll talk about how we're going to implement these with clients. So most of the time, I just tell clients that we're going to do like these weird exercises that are going to feel like kind of weird and different, but that for whatever reason, they help our body kind of calm down. And it's because of this really long nerve called the vagus nerve that connects our brain and our body, and it's the way that the brain and the body communicate. And that sometimes when we activate this, it can kind of calm our body and our brain down and help us tolerate things a little bit easier. So this is the most basic polyvagal exercise. I'm sure some of you have seen this. If you've done a training with me before, I use this one a lot just because I think that it's an easy one to show how quickly you can access and stimulate the vagus nerve. We'll talk about a couple different activities and exercises that you can do. So first and foremost, what I want you to do is we're just going to be rotating our head from side to side. And I just want you to notice which side has more tension and which side has less tension. So you're kind of testing your range of motion. So notice which side feels tighter, which side feels looser, or has a better range of motion. Now we're going to do similar to what we did with diaphragmatic breathing. So for those of you that can, put your hands above your head. If you can't do this piece, you don't need to put your hands above your head, but you do need to keep your head stationary. And you're going to keep your head still, so we're not turning our head. And one of the reasons we put our arms above the head is think about cupping the back of your head from keeping it from turning. And keeping your head stationary, what we're going to do is we're going to start with looking as far as we can to the right. And we're going to hold that gaze to the right for about 30 seconds. So go ahead, keeping head stationary. We're just taking our eyes as far to the right as we can. And we're going to hold this gaze to the right. You can blink if needed. It's okay if you're thinking or feeling like my eyes are tired or this really feels straining. That's normal. So hold that gaze to the right. Continue to breathe while you're doing this. You can even take a few deep breaths. And as you hold that gaze to the right, we're going to hold this for about 10 more seconds. Go as far to the right as you can with those eyes. Okay, go ahead, close your eyes, bring that back to center. You can blink, close your eyes if you want to, get oriented. We're going to do the same thing this time, but now we're going to go to the left. So same thing, keep that head stationary for me and take that gaze as far as we can to the left. So as far as we can. Hold that gaze, blink if you need to. And hold it for about 10 more seconds. Again, it's okay if those eyes feel strained, totally normal. Okay, go ahead, close those eyes, bring your eyes back to center. I like to blink and kind of get reoriented for a minute because usually it will take your eyes a second to get kind of able to not be like dizzy. So once you feel ready, I want you to do the same thing. Test that range of motion for me and notice what changed or shifted. Usually most of the time you'll feel it right away. That shift or that change where you notice an increase in that ability or to have more an ability or greater range of motion in the side that was tense. That's kind of that basic vagus nerve activation. What we're doing there is when we hold those eyes to one side and then the other, it's triggering that vagus nerve again to kind of communicate and say that we're in a state of relax. So it's almost tricking us into getting into a state of calm, which again, I know it's weird. And same thing, if I'm to do this with a client, I always do these exercises with them, just similar to like what I would be doing with all of you right now. I feel like it creates more connection and it's not as distant as just watching someone do them. So the next one we're going to do is what we call, this is called a modified Valsalva maneuver. This is often used in like hospital emergency rooms. And they use this as a way to lower heart rate. So people that come in with a really high heart rate, it's going to help kind of reduce that heart rate. And it's triggering ultimately the vagus nerve to kick in is what it really does. So I want you for about 10 seconds, you're just going to take your heart rate for a moment. So just count those beats for 10 seconds. I'll tell you when to stop. Ready, set, go. Okay. You can write that number down or just note that number for yourself. So what we're going to do with this one, it's going to be a little bit different. This one, you might have to practice this one for just a moment with me. So I'm going to explain it a couple different times. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a big inhale with our nose. So you're going to inhale as much as you can. So go ahead and just practice an inhale for me. And then we're going to hold that. When you reach the top of that inhale, you can let that go. So when we take that inhale in, we're going to close our mouth, and then I want you to also pinch your nose. And then I want you to, you're going to push out, but without taking an exhale. So almost like when you're trying to blow up a balloon, you know how when you're first trying to push air into a balloon, you can feel internally it's like pushing against all of those internal structures in our body. So as we're holding our breath, so we're going to take an inhale in, hold our breath, close our mouth, pinch our nose, and then we're going to imagine pushing out. So like if your body is a balloon, we're putting tension and trying to kind of like push out like we're blowing up a balloon, but with our mouth and our nose covered. We're going to hold this for 15 seconds. Okay. So everyone, go ahead, take a deep breath in with me through your nose. Hold that. Now pinch your nose, close your mouth. And you're going to hold that with your mouth closed, nose pinched for 15 seconds. Okay, go ahead, release. So as you exhale, now I want you to breathe. We're going to breathe for about 45 seconds, just in through our nose and out through our nose if you can. And I want them to be long breaths. So take as long as you can on each breath. So in through your nose, out through your nose. We're doing this for about 45 seconds. In through your nose, out through your nose. Slow, deep breaths in through that nose, out through that nose. Do a couple more breaths. Couple more. And do one more for me. And then when you're done, same thing, we're going to take our heart rate for about 10 more seconds. So go ahead, find that pulse. And I'm going to count for 10 seconds. So once you find it, go ahead and start counting. And go ahead and stop. You can notice if it's the same. Typically we have to do this one for a set of like 3 to 5 times roughly. But just notice, sometimes if you haven't done body work, it can increase the heart rate just a little bit from not being present in the body. But typically what you'll find by about the third set of this, you'll see the heart rate decrease just a little bit. And we're only taking it for, those 10 seconds, but you'll typically see it drop anywhere from 1 to 3 beats. If you want a more activating, kind of truer form of that, any of you that do like yoga or any good somatic work, one of the things that you do as a modification for this one is you would have them lay on their back while they're breathing for that 45 seconds to 1 minute, and you have them elevate their legs to a 45 degrees. So it's just above their heart level. And you can rest them on a chair or whatever. What that do is it will send kind of that blood flow and oxygen back up through the heart. And usually calm that down, but that will add a little bit more of an activation. You'll see quicker results without having to do it as many sets. So there's a variety of different polyvagal exercises you can do like that are really going to help people kind of get activated, calm down. We're showing them simple ways to kind of just get reconnected or reoriented with their body. And one of the things that I really like about vagus nerve exercises is it's not about talk therapy. So it's not like we're not listing off like a gratitude list. We're not requiring them to do things that might be challenging or that they're not going to use at this state because of, the discrepancies of what we know is occurring in their brain. We're really just using exercises that don't require a ton of cognitive processing, but it's really all just about somatically trying to get them de-escalated. And we're going to use these at times when we see them come out of their window of tolerance. So if we see them get heavily activated, maybe they go into a place where they're just dissociating, they're checking out. This will be a really good way to kind of pull them back in to getting them centered and grounded. This is going to help them stay present. It's going to help kind of target things like detachment as well. And again, ultimately, we're trying to create and teach intrinsically the safety within themselves that maybe they've never had before. But it's going to really help them be able to, at some point, be a little bit more vulnerable. But these are really good if we're using them for like titration and pendulation to get them in that window of tolerance. It's something that we can go back to when we get into EMDR. That's going to help, like, let's say they get a little bit too triggered or activated. These are good resourcing skills that we can come back to and utilize when needed. So we've talked about we've got these different sequences of ways that people can respond. And so as we're moving into assessing what we're going to be targeting for EMDR, we want to look at people's responses to this. So are they more of a hyper aroused kind of individual? Do they tend to get more irritable? Do they have kind of that fight response? Do we notice that there's difficulty concentrating and impulsivity? And these are all things that we're going to slowly work up to targeting, which we're going to see how to do that after lunch. Are they more of a hyper or hypo aroused where maybe they're a little bit more dissociative, they seem more disconnected, they present with low energy, kind of dysthymic? And in true dissociation, we'll see kind of just this freeze or even maybe fawning, where they're just totally checked out, avoidant, kind of just detached from everything that's going on. All of those are important for us to touch on briefly, just because these are going to be roadblocks in our EMDR process. They're going to create kind of these roadblocks in our healing that's going to kind of lead to some barriers within treatment. Some of these can look like there can be a subconscious, the way that things are stored in our subconscious memory, there's going to be barriers that we run into that make trauma processing very difficult. So the subconscious and those memories and those perceptions that we form and those arousal states that we have are going to tell us a lot about how activated someone is, where they're at in their own window of tolerance, and it's going to tell us where we need to have some more resources in place when those kind of barriers, or we start to notice that kind of activation take over or start to come into fruition. So the subconscious is really where a lot of those trauma memories are going to be stored. That neural network of trauma lies heavily in that subconscious. This is also in the subconscious memory where our perceptions and meanings are held based on our past experiences. And trauma is not about logic, it's about safety, right? But this is where, in order for us to truly work through roadblocks, we have to have some really good resources in place that are going to help us create safety when someone gets escalated. And that's kind of some of the first skills of EMDR that we're going to be learning today, which I think are extremely useful whether you do EMDR or not. So as we kind of move through this last piece of the psychoeducation around trauma, and I use this example a lot, especially as I explain trauma to clients and what EMDR actually is going to help them do. I use this analogy of the stoplight quite frequently. And so to me, I liken and I explain trauma and the way that trauma impacts the brain similar to a stoplight. And so I think of the brain very similar to the stoplight in relation to how it functions and operates as it relates to trauma. So this frontal lobe, this front region of our brain, is similar to that of a green light. So this would be like we're driving down the road, and this is where when we see green lights, right? And I want you to imagine for a moment, this is like green lights, not a lot of traffic. So this isn't city driving. This is like green lights. You're just kind of driving. Everything's good. The green light's indicating there's not a lot that we need to be on guard for. We're just kind of present. We're taking in the surroundings, but we're not on guard. This green light is when everything's kind of operating the way that it's intended to. Things are running smoothly. All's kind of in order. Front part of the frontal lobe, that front region of the brain, is intended to do the same thing. It's what helps us function, make good choices, problem solve, and it's slow to kind of react. It's just very grounded, right? Then we have this mid region of the brain, this yellow light region of the brain, which is kind of in the middle of the brain. And this is where the amygdala is. Most of the times clients don't really care what the amygdala is, so I like to use the analogy of, I reference this as Amy. So the amygdala, I call her Amy for short. This is this mid region of the brain, and this portion of the brain is there kind of as just like a yellow light that you would see as you're driving down the road. It's to alert us to caution and danger. And it's just there to kind of, in a healthy scenario, it alerts us that there could be danger. So let's say, again, we're driving down the road, it's green lights, it's been green lights for a while, all of a sudden we see a blinking yellow light, right? So what Amy tells us when this occurs is she says, okay, this is telling me that I need to scan my surroundings and make sure that I'm safe. So we take in all of our surroundings, we look for oncoming traffic, we check our rear view mirrors, we look ahead. And once Amy knows that there's no threat, so let's say we get through the blinking yellow light, there was no threat, we come out unscathed, right? There was nothing that was dangerous. Amy kind of goes back to green light. She's like, oh, we're safe, nothing happened. Now, where this becomes important for trauma is that Amy doesn't forget when trauma occurs. So if anything negative happens, Amy's going to remember everything that happened. And not the story, everything. She's going to remember every single sensory detail that occurred when we experienced the trauma. So she's going to remember the sounds, the taste, the touch, the smells, everything that she saw. And that's in an effort to protect us. And she's going to inventory all those, and she's going to say, hey, these things, when these things occurred, we were in danger. And then she's going to use those in the future to alert us when there could be a perceived threat of danger. So what this would look like is you're driving down the road and it's been green lights. All of a sudden you see this green light change to yellow. So you slow down in your car, but the car behind you didn't see this light turn, right? So it slams into the back of you. And as this is occurring, this is what Amy's doing. So Amy's remembering the sound of the crunching metal and the breaking glass, the sound of the screeching tires. She's remembering the smell of the burning rubber, maybe the smell of the oil, the smell of the maybe heated up metal and engine. She's remembering the song that was on the radio. She's remembering maybe the intersection that you were at. If you were eating and drinking anything when that happened, she might associate that same taste. And she's going to store all of that. And she's saying, hey, each of these details resulted in us almost being hurt. And Amy's not about logic, she's just about survival. And so she's going to store those. And when Amy gets alerted like this with trauma, she sends us into this red light region of the brain, this fight, flight, or freeze response, that back part of the brain. So when Amy sees, okay, there was danger, she sends us into a response, right? And those responses are fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And that's where cortisol is released, adrenaline's released, and she's there to try and keep us safe. Now, here's the key of what happens and what makes this very much like a stoplight, and that's important for clients to understand. Just like a stoplight with the brain, when Amy has been triggered or activated, if they go into a back brain, so they have a trigger that hasn't been worked through, and they go into this fight, flight, or freeze response, just like a stoplight, a green light and a red light cannot be on at the same time. So what this means is that they can't make logical, concrete decisions because that region of the brain was offline. So red light, green light cannot be on at the same time. You're in one region or the other. And so this is helpful for clients that say, like, I don't know why I reacted or responded the way I did. Like, that's not how I wanted to react or respond. I don't know why that was my reaction. And this is where you help them, like, well, of course you didn't want to respond that way. If you had been in like your logical state of mind, you wouldn't have responded that way. Now, the other part of this that's important to help them identify is that we think about our triggers have to be around experiences, right? So it has to be around like a specific event. And we think of it as like this narrative. Trauma memories are stored very differently than our long and short-term memory. They are not stored with a beginning, middle, and an end. Trauma is stored in those sensory bits and pieces that Amy holds on to, those sensory details. And so what's going to happen is it's just going to take one of those triggers to send us into this back brain if we haven't adequately worked through some of these triggers. So that could mean maybe a year later, you're driving down the road and you hear screeching tires. All of a sudden, your heart starts racing, right? It's pounding, and you feel your palms get sweaty on the steering wheel. That's because Amy's going, oh my gosh, the last time that I heard screeching rubber, we were in a bad accident and it wasn't safe. And so she prepares us to fight. So it just takes one of those sensory details to get us into a triggered state. So when I'm doing or working up to EMDR with someone, I want to know what those activators are so that they can be targeted when we get into some of our processing, which we're going to look at later. So keep in mind too with this is like I said, this is important, and I think it's an important piece for clients, but it's also an important piece when you do any type of trauma work, specifically EMDR, that trauma, again, like I just said, it doesn't have that beginning, middle, and an end. Trauma is stored very differently in our memory networks. And a lot of trauma is about the perception and the meaning that we give something, and it's stored in that subconscious memory stores, and it can affect our motivation it can also affect our motivation to store other memories in long-term stores, because the brain can say, I'm more worried about survival. And so it can affect, again, that memory of long-term memory and short-term, because the brain's more on high arousal and not as concerned as storing long-terms. So oftentimes we'll see kind of an atrophied long-term memory stores in the hippocampus, which is interesting. Trauma can also prevent information from coming together. So Amy kind of keeps those things fragmented in an effort to keep us safe. And until we've gone back through and reprocessed those, they'll usually stay fragmented that way. And it can also change the way the procedural memory works. If you see here under this kind of green region, so it gives this good example, right? For example, a person might tense up and unconsciously alter their posture, which could lead to pain or even numbness. So this procedural kind of the way that you interact or engage, you can start to react or respond in different ways that are based on a survival response. And oftentimes what people will say is, I don't even know what triggered me. Like I was totally fine, and then all of a sudden I wasn't. And this is where, again, having kind of this recount or a trigger dump of the sensory details for each time they're triggered can be really helpful. So Shapiro started a lot of her work around EMDR with understanding this memory network component. And what she found is that these memory networks, like we've all kind of come to know, are very heavily impacted by our past experiences and by the beliefs that maybe we took away from those experiences or that were influenced by those experiences. And then what we know is that those behaviors that we end up having or reactions are largely influenced and shaped around some of those prior experiences that we may have had. And our senses, like all of these sensory details that we're talking about, they're all intrinsically connected to our past and to those past experiences. And so sometimes we can have kind of what Shapiro refers to as like this maladaptive resolution that occurs where memories become restricted or fragmented, like we were just talking about. And so what we're going to end up finding is that we're going to try and tap in with EMDR. It's going to help us tap into making full resolution of some of those fragmented memories, but also bringing that adaptive resolution network back online, that brain's natural ability to heal itself. And it's going to help us have the brain function the way that it's really been intended to. So before we get into learning some of these resourcing skills, one thing that's important to really be aware of is when a client is in or outside of their window of tolerance. And this is also something that makes trauma processing difficult, right? So when do they shut down? When do we know to keep working with them? When do we know that they need a break or that maybe we need to titrate some of these experiences? And so we know that with trauma processing, one thing that we're going to see is we know that it might be too much or that we might need to give them a sense of relief. And again, put a bookmark on this because this will make sense when we get into the protocol this afternoon, is that when they start to say that their emotions and their reactions feel completely out of control, when we see that true fight, flight, or freeze response, that's another indicative kind of place that's telling us they're outside of that window of tolerance. And when we're seeing it's very difficult for them to regulate, so meaning like dysregulation can occur, and what we're going to learn about what we call an abreaction, which is a strong emotional response that's normal to occur for about 5 to 10 minutes. If it struggles to come back after that, then we need to do something to help get them regulated and titrated back into a state of safety. And so a lot of what's going to help as we learn to use some of these EMDR skills and keep them in the processing smoothly of EMDR moving forward is using a lot of those self-soothing techniques. So those polyvagal exercises, which you guys got a glimpse at, that body tuning exercise. We talked about the different sensual stimulation and bilateral stimulation kind of exercises and things that you can do. And we're going to learn more about bilateral stimulation as it's specific to EMDR. And one thing, I have a consultee that I consult with who is based in the Philippines. And one of the ways that she keeps people in the window of tolerance that I just think is brilliant is she has a client that gets really activated and dissociated. And one way to keep them in that window of tolerance is when this occurs in session or what have you, she'll have them do basic math problems. What's 2 plus 2? And it's triggering like that logical brain to kind of have to come into play and start to fire neurons. So that can also be a really great way to get them to start to think and feel kind of simultaneously. And then what we're going to start to learn is some of the basic ways that we keep them in the window of tolerance is by using these early EMDR skills that we call resourcing skills. And these are pivotal for, to me, whether you do EMDR, like I said, or not. These are skills that I think are just wonderful for anyone that's doing trauma work, that can really be useful for clients to get regulated and grounded. So know that not a lot of good processing is going to be able to occur in our trauma work if they get outside of that window of tolerance. So processing will be blocked and inhibited when they get out of their, whatever their tolerated arousal level is. And so if we see this red or blue kind of region occur, we have to do something to get them grounded and reoriented. So this is where EMDR comes in. So we've gotten through a lot of this trauma stuff, which I appreciate you guys kind of bearing with me on, but I do think it's important that we understand kind of the mechanism of why the brain responds to trauma the way that it does. So now we get to get in for the rest of our time together. Before we go to lunch, we're going to start looking at EMDR just a little bit, and then the rest of today and tomorrow is going to look at where EMDR does come in and what EMDR can do. And we're going to pull back on a lot of the work that we've learned this morning, and it's really going to be useful and helpful in us conceptualizing how to implement and utilize some of these EMDR interventions that we're going to talk about. So as this kind of, as EMDR came in, and it's been since the late 80s now, in 1987 actually, when Francine Shapiro started to see a connection between the REM cycle at night and the way that eye movements could assist during that REM cycle with activating this brain's natural information processing system. And this came at kind of a paramount time professionally, because in the late 80s, there was a lot of professionals that were saying, there's so much trauma going on. We're running into these blocks. We can't get past a lot of these barriers with people that have experienced trauma. So she started to kind of study and experiment with different ways that these eye movements access that adaptive information network, which eventually led, which we're going to get into a bit more, to the formation of EMDR. And at first, as we all probably know, EMDR was heavily criticized. And I really feel like EMDR has really gained a lot of respect over the last 30 plus years, but specifically even just in the last decade, there's been a lot more notoriety and credibility given to EMDR. And it is one of the most researched and evidence-based treatment modalities for trauma and PTSD that now exists in the world today. And it's been endorsed by everyone from the VA to a variety of other World Health Organizations that really endorse the implications and the success that EMDR can offer. So I'm going to show us just a quick 2-minute video of what EMDR is. This is sometimes a good psychoeducation video that I will share with clients to help them understand kind of just a quick snapshot of what EMDR is. So let me pull this up for us.
If you have post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, all kinds of things in everyday life can trigger a traumatic memory and create stress. specific places, loud noises, large crowds, even everyday things at your home. The thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations you had during your trauma can affect how you feel, act, and think today. So how do you reduce the stress caused by these memories? One form of talk therapy that has proven effective for treating PTSD is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. Memories can be made up of many images and related feelings, and EMDR helps you reprocess the trauma to experience it in a different way. EMDR starts with history taking. This involves describing important life events and the trauma you want to work on, as well as your treatment goals. You'll learn ways to manage your anxiety too. Your therapist will ask you to look back at the trauma and think, what negative thought about yourself do you have from that experience? What would you like to believe about yourself going forward? How bad does it feel to you right now? You'll start processing a memory from there. Your therapist will have you move your eyes back and forth while you think about the trauma and those related feelings. During this phase, new and useful information comes up, and old, painful thoughts, memories, and feelings fade and become less distressing. At the end of processing, you'll look back at the positive beliefs that you want to have about yourself. Processing is over when these positive beliefs feel true to you and there are no unpleasant sensations in your body. This phase of treatment may take several sessions. You may also work through more than one traumatic memory before treatment is over. EMDR doesn't require you to take medication. With your therapist's help, you'll follow a step-by-step program for about 3 months. Most people who've completed EMDR show noticeable improvement in their symptoms, and many no longer have PTSD. EMDR works well for both men and women, and it's evidence-based, which means EMDR has been proven to work in multiple research studies. If EMDR sounds like it could be right for you, talk to your doctor about finding an EMDR provider. Or visit the National Center for PTSD website at www.ptsd.va.gov to learn more about EMDR and other PTSD treatment.
So I would say too, if none of you, or if there's some of you that haven't been on to the website that's posted here, ptsd.va.gov, I highly recommend it just for clinical resources. Lots of really great trauma screening tools that you can utilize, different measures that are really all research-based and endorsed by the VA and the World Health Organization. So some pretty good free resources on there as well, and some good psychoeducation about just what trauma is and what EMDR is, among some other treatment modalities that are used to treat EMDR. Like I said, I will put a link on the resource document that I'm going to make you guys, that will have a link to this video as well as 2 other videos that I like that talk about what EMDR is, because I found that these little brief videos tend to explain it to clients just a lot simpler than maybe sometimes we can do as clinicians. So I like to utilize these for that, just to help them kind of understand what EMDR is. When I get into teaching EMDR, especially as I introduce it to a client, a lot of clients now, which has been a nice change in the recent years, are starting to already be somewhat familiar with EMDR, or they've heard of EMDR from a family member or a friend who said it really worked and helped them. And I still want them to know what it is, because it is such a different treatment approach than what I think people think of doing when they come to counseling. And so I do think it's helpful to provide some information to them on what EMDR looks like. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our slides really quick. And we'll be going to lunch in about 15 minutes. Yay, for anyone who's ready for a break. Okay, so to honor the fidelity of EMDR, this is where I always like to start. This is the definition of EMDR that was developed by, again, Francine Shapiro, who's passed away in the last few years. But really, she gave us such a gift with EMDR and has just led to paramount changes in helping people with this model. So I'm grateful to be able to share and honor her work with this. So I always start with the definition of EMDR. So EMDR, for those of you that don't know, means eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. Hence why we call it EMDR, right? What's funny is EMDR, when it first came out, was really known for the eye movement piece, right? That's kind of all what we think of when we think of EMDR is like the eye movements. And I remember, and I told you guys this earlier, but I was like, there's no way my clients are going to come in and be like, I'm going to be like, follow my fingers, right? I kind of thought it was like hokey, but it really isn't, which is kind of what makes it amazing. So EMDR now, what we know is the research and evidence has continued to build and expand since the development of the model in the late 80s. We know that there are a variety of different other bilateral stimulation techniques, which is what the eye movements are referred to as a bilateral stimulation technique, what we call a BLS, or sometimes you might see it as BS, bilateral stimulation. But BLS is kind of what we refer to that as, or you might refer to it as dual awareness, which EMDR loves acronyms, and so sometimes you might see the DAS, which just means dual awareness or bilateral stimulation. So the eye movements ultimately were the